Alright, one sec. Okay. I'm gonna check on my phone.
Sure.
I might have to get a new stream key.
What's that?
It's how... Oh no, it looks like it's working. Okay, basically, a stream key is how Streamlabs, or whatever streaming service you're on, communicates with Twitch to broadcast.
Gotcha.
Alright, so basically my plan is to just kind of go card by card. We've got a lot on here, and my focus for today is mostly going to be constructed of various formats. So I've got some legacy cards on here, we've got some modern and pioneer stuff, a potential standard implication as well. Obviously this is a standard legal set, so most of the focus when they design this set is going to be in terms of limited and standard, exactly. So this isn't a set where they would actually have known that Pioneer was coming. We may start to see those a little bit in the fall or about a year from now. So these cards don't really have that format in mind. So
there may be some stuff that like maybe shouldn't be here because of Pioneer, or
well, there could potentially be some really broken cards in the format.
What I mean.
Yeah, kind of like Thassa's Oracle type nonsense or Underworld Breach, stuff like that. That ordinarily would not slip through the cracks if that was a format on their radar. But we don't really know whether or not Pioneer is going to be a format that they're actually looking to prepare for when they design these sets. We know that they generally have standard in mind, and they don't have the resource load to actually test for modern and legacy and vintage and even commander to an extent. So we're used to seeing broken things in non-standard formats.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so the cards are in no particular order. It's kind of when I loaded up and saw what cards I wanted to talk about, it was kind of just the order that they appeared. So it's mostly multicolor cards first, and for the most part, it's going to be just a smattering of different cards. So I'm just going to go through and I'm just going to start on a card, and then we can like see if you just disagree with some of my assessments, agree with them, and it's basically going to be the format.
Cool.
So the first one we have up is Sprite Dragon, this one over here, and I personally love cards like this. This is a little bit of a callback to cards we've seen be successful throughout Magic's history. We had a card like Quirion Dryad, which in the early to mid-2000s was actually quite powerful because it lets you play a bit of a tempo game and escalate your game plan. Obviously, we've seen cards like Deeproot Champion, which is somewhat analogous to this and very similar to Prowess cards as well, but I think this one has a ton of potential in Pioneer, for example. We've already seen like Storm Chaser Mage decks be a little bit fringe, and while this isn't actually a wizard to work with Adelies, it's just keeping the counters is incredibly powerful. And I would be interested to see if this also makes like a blue-red like Kiln Fiend Manamorphose type Prowess deck in Modern a little bit better too, because having a threat that gets to keep the counters is pretty appealing.
Yeah, I feel like having the power stay and making it like not a wizard makes it a lot more viable, just because when you don't have to like rebuild every single turn, where like you play this on turn 2, then maybe your turn 3 you cast like a couple spells, and then it's like maybe a 3/3 or a 4/4 going into your turn 4. Like that's gonna be pretty large.
Yeah.
That's like the main drawback to a lot of the prowess cards is you kind of have like your big prowess turns, and then
they're
all of a
really
sudden you're
mopey.
left with some like dorky creature, but this kind of like over the course of a game can get pretty large.
Yeah, definitely.
So, and any deck that's going to be trying to kill things with damage base and not just like straight removal spells is going to have a tough time, I feel like, with this card.
Yeah, I think it's kind of similar to Thing in the Ice in terms of aggression for a lot of these different decks. It's like on its initial start, it doesn't really do much, right? Like,
Yeah.
dealing 1 damage for 2 mana is pretty bad if we're being honest, and it doesn't attack through even like a lot of the spirits in Pioneer or even some of the flyers in Modern. But it plays really well with cards that prowess cards don't really play super well with, like cards like Monastery Swiss Spear. They need a lot of burn spells, and you have to be playing a lot of proactive cards. You can't really play as many cards like Opt and Counter Magic and actually be able to leverage that. Like, prowess is really bad with Counter Magic, right?
Yeah.
Because we want to trigger the spells on our turn to push through damage. But Sprite Dragon doesn't care if it's a Counter Magic. You can play it on turn 3 and hold up, like, I don't know, a Lightning Bolt or a Spell Pierce in Modern, potentially. And, like, that's pretty good. Like, you attack for 1, and sure, that doesn't seem great, but if they don't do anything, you attack for 2 the next turn, maybe you attack for 5 the next turn, I don't know. Like, there's enough 1-mana cantrips and also enough, like, playable 1 and 2-mana spells in most formats that I think this card just has a ton of potential.
Yeah, like, even though it has haste, I feel like you can play this card defensively a lot better than some of the prowess creatures.
Oh,
Because
absolutely.
eventually, like, let's say with prowess creatures, if you're playing it defensively, you're giving up damage on your next turn. But sure, you don't get the hits in on the turn that you decide to hold this back. But on next turns, it's going to still have that power left over,
Yeah.
which I feel like is pretty huge.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of like the play patterns of like Enigma Drake when that was in
Yeah.
Standard, where you'll play it as like a 1/4 or a 2/4, and you'll like hold it back as a blocker, and then if your opponent does stuff or you like interact with their guys, and then all of a sudden the game's just over because you just have 2 like 7-power flyers.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm excited to try it out. I think it'll end up being a little bit better than Terramander was in those types of archetypes. So I think it's a multi-format card. Like, there's even rumblings of potential legacy application as well in something like Blue-Red Delver, where they already play Dreadhorde Arcanist as well.
Huh, cool.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Next up is Dire Tactics, and this one it isn't really unique in as far as removal spells go. We've seen cards like D-Spark, which have similar conditions. Even 2-mana destroy target creature. Like, we've had those types of effects before, like Dreadbore. And this is actually pretty comparable to a well-known black staple throughout most of Magic's history called Vendetta, which actually, instead of exiling the creature, it destroys it and can't be regenerated, and then you lose life equal to its toughness. But the ability to turn this into just actually 2-mana exile target creature in, I think, a wide variety of decks in multiple formats is pretty appealing. Like, not having a drawback on this card makes it phenomenal.
Agreed.
And I think it's very easy. There's enough playable humans in most formats now. Like, there's potential Modern application, because giving like Esper a flexible removal spell that's not horrible to play, like, sure, like, it may hurt initially, but it plays pretty well with stuff like Snapcaster Mage. So I'd be interested to see in in Modern if it's enough to make the cut. I don't think it would be, but there's enough draw in a lot of reactive colors that I could see it. But I think the coolest thing is when you start looking at like Pioneer or Standard, and there's a ton of just random humans that are good, like Tireless Tracker, for example. This is Dire Tactics is a card that really wants to go in like mid-rangey decks, and Tireless Tracker in Pioneer is one of the best mid-range threats for the green decks in terms of dominating game states. Now, if you're a Traverse deck, you normally don't play more than like one of each human, but maybe there's a world in which you can move away and start playing like Abzan again, or a Niv Mizzet deck with like some different creatures. I don't know. I think this card's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of pushing humans a good amount in this set, because they have kind of like their non-human theme, and then they have like the humans in the background, and being able to turn this into just a straight 2-mana exile is pretty powerful. Also dealing with like some pesky threats like Euro or like Croxa, I feel like is going to come up with a card like this. So if it's in a format where you really care about exiling it rather than just destroying it, you're going to try and put this into your deck.
Yeah, I think that's most formats right now. Now, it might be a little bit slow for something like Pioneer or Modern, because a lot of the cards that matter end up not really being creatures you can trade 1-for-1 with. In terms of removal, but I could see this like being a one of in some decks like that. But
Yeah.
I really like how they're pushing humans in the set in general. They're not pushing them in the way that, Innistrad pushed them, as they're this tribe that grows bigger, that has synergies based on how many humans you have. It's a little bit different. They've got cards that check if they're human. Obviously, they have a non human mechanic, which I actually like the tension there. I really like when human is pushed in this kind of ancillary way to your game plan, rather than I want 12 humans in play and I want to put a counter on all of them.
Yeah, because
So,
a lot of the human cards just want to make sure you have like one or two other humans,
right.
so that way you don't have to like, okay, well, if I want to put these human cards in my deck, I just need to get every single human, like you were saying, whereas you only need like a couple good value ones.
Yeah, I love that type of design. Generally, it makes tribal themes work a little bit better in limited, which I think is really important. Because part of the problem in most limited formats, when you have any sort of tribal effect, is getting enough of that creature type. Like maybe you have to play like a bad Merfolk or whatever, so your Merfolk Lord is worth playing, and then you kind of get these really awkward games where you don't draw your tribal payoff, and now you've got a bunch of crappy little creatures. But cards like this that are just good on their own and become just a little bit better when you have even just one random creature of that type, I really enjoy the design.
Yeah, the fact that you don't need to have the human to make this card viable, like if it was just like if it like targets something but it didn't exile it unless you controlled a human, then obviously it'd be a lot worse. But just
Right.
depending on if you're in a spot to leverage your life total a little bit more, then not having the human may not hurt as much.
Yeah. And as we said before, exiling comes up a lot.
Exactly.
You know. You know. Right. So next one up is part of I believe it's 12 cards with companion in the set, and it's one of the new mechanics for Ikoria. Is Obosh the Prey Piercer, and this is the red black one. I believe this is, yeah. There's only two of them that actually made the list that we're going to talk about. But I didn't really see a ton of people really hyping up this particular card. But I think it's one of the better ones in terms of constructed play. Obviously, these cards have a ton of commander application. Um,
Hmm.
but I mean, assuming that they don't end up getting banned there or whatever. But I personally enjoy the flavor of these mechanics. Now, uh, other card games, particularly digital card games, have done very similar things where they can quickly check your deck to make sure that you fit the configuration. Hearthstone has had that in many different sets, and it's kind of a new thing to Magic here. But I really think that with the ability to throw in different sizes of creatures and mana costs and color combinations, that Magic can kind of reach um, more conditions than those games can. And I think a lot of these cards in the set actually, make for some very interesting deck building decisions. Now, the problem with this type of card that I have is you don't want to push the payoff too high, because then you kind of get a homogenous type of gameplay and it limits deck building, because these are deck building restrictions. So, we're more likely, I think, to see these cards underpowered than we are to see them overpowered. But the reason I think that this one has a lot of potential is because doubling the damage that a source you control would deal is absolutely insane. Like we've seen enchantments that do that for 4 mana. We've seen cards like Torbrand that increase by 2, but actually like doubling onto a reasonably sized creature, I think, is incredibly powerful. And it should be noted that if the payoff is enough for a card like this, you probably just play all 4 in the main deck, or like 1 in the sideboard, 3 in the main deck, and because that way you can have like access to that effect even if they end up killing the creature. And I think that's something that's super cool. And in terms of this one in particular, like 5 mana 3/5 doubling all of the damage that a source you control would deal is like pretty ridiculous. um, like
Yeah,
it's
I
gonna
would agree with that.
it's gonna work off like shock, for example, right? It costs 1, so it has an odd CMC, so it's gonna be 4 damage. Like all your 1 drops are gonna deal 2 damage, which admittedly isn't as good as Torbrand, but I think there's a lot of potential there. Um,
Like, how would you say the best way to build a deck? Would it just be like mono red and you're just kind of like, and you just throw this in there? Because you can go like on turn one, you play like a 1 mana spell. On turn two, maybe you try and play two 1 mana spells.
right.
And then like turn three, then you have like hopefully a 3 drop. And then turn four, you're kind of like carrying up the curve, like trying to double spell on certain turns that you maybe wouldn't before.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of ways to evaluate this card. Is obviously there's some tension in the fact that this is a 5-drop that cares about you having more 1s and 3s in your deck, which can be pretty awkward because like, typically 1-drops don't really scale as well in later in the game as you would like, but I think there's a lot of application for this because we've got spectacle cards that kind of let you cheat a little bit, like Skewer the Critics and Light Up the Stage. Like, maybe you just play them on turn 3 for their cost anyway, so they kind of help fill that little bit of gap that you need in order to fit your curve requirements. So I think you kind of have to be a lower to the ground deck, but even cards like Skewer the Critics becomes ridiculous with this card. So I would probably look to play like a bunch of 1 mana burn spells with some cost reductive cards rather than actually 3-drops necessarily.
Yep, that's pretty cool actually. Thinking about Spectacle, are there any other kind of tricks like that with this card? Are we mainly talking about standard for Obosh?
I think in standard is where this card has the most potential, and like obviously Skewer the Critics and some of the other mono red. This kind of goes in the Torbrand slot, and you need a reason to not play 2-drops, which I'm not sure we're there yet, but I think it also has other applications in Pioneer, for example. Now, this card is also black, for what it's worth. So, in theory, you could build a mono-black version that gets to play this effect, but you can also, play it with a bunch of 1-mana burn spells, because this is kind of like you start with an 8th card in your hand. You could also just, this card doesn't need to be your plan A. It can be a plan B that I just always have. You need to build your deck around the deck building restriction, but you're always going to have access to this card in a game.
Yeah.
So, even cards that, let you see extra cards get a lot better because now, your whole deck is meeting the condition. So, if you've got, cantrips and stuff, maybe that's, a way to mitigate it.
Yeah, or maybe you're playing, maybe it's Jund, and you're kind of, ramping on 1 and 3.
Right.
And then trying to get this out, a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
That could be kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the fact that it's going to double anything with odd CMC now, something like Banefire or any of your X spells are going to have an odd CMC in your deck, and that's a way to kind of fill the gap on 2 and 4. So you could potentially just play an X spell on 2 or an X spell on 4, and then later, as long as you make sure that the X plus the normal cost is going to be odd, you can get a payoff with Obosh. And I think that's something that's kind of cool.
Yeah. Because, the main, drawback of Torbrand is that you kind of have to play it in a mono-red deck, because it only cares about red sources and it's kind of hard to cast based on its mana cost. But something like this, you can kind of get a little bit more fancy with what decks it can go in.
Yeah, you could just be a red-black deck, and it's totally fine. You could be a black-green deck or whatever with Land Elves, I guess, in other formats. But I think there's some interesting stuff. Nick brought up you can play this with Bonecrusher Giants.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
So adventure creatures are a way to make this work. Obviously CMC's 3, it's going to deal 4 when you do it, but it's also going to deal 4 when they target it. And 8 when they take damage from it. So that's a good point.
And it gives you something to do on turn 2, which may be something like, if you're trying to play this card as your companion, is going to have you kind of lacking, but being able to cheat that way with the giant would be pretty sweet.
Yeah. I really like that. And I think in terms of standard, having Bonecrusher and Light Up the Stage and Skewer gives you a ton of flexibility on your turns as to what you're going to do. And in Pioneer, we actually have Shock and Wild Slash, and Wizard's Lightning also counts. So, maybe there's, stuff you can do with that aspect. I don't think it plays as well in, mono-black aggro, but, maybe there's something there. We've got more evasive creatures in black,
Yeah, missing out on Scrap Heap Scrounger and Rankle and Spawn of Mayhem seems problematic, so I don't know if it has a great fit there.
Yeah.
But in the red decks, definitely seems like it could be interesting. But the thing about the card like this is I don't know if it's better in a red-black deck than the generic red-black sacrifice deck that's going around right now.
Right.
But maybe it gives you a different angle to kind of...
Yeah, I think the advantage of a card like this is it's kind of card advantage in these aggro decks, so maybe even if it's a little bit worse than Torbrand, the fact that you always have access to it might make it a little bit like worth building around. And in standard, it might be a more legitimate drawback to build around odd CMC because 2-drops tend to be a bit better than 1-drops. But we have reasonable enough 1-drops. Now, we don't get to play something like Cavalcade, but we have a reasonable enough 1-drops. Something like Scorch Spitter is great with this, right? So I think it might be worth it. But also in Pioneer, we can play it with Chain Whirler, which is kind of cool. In the same way that Torbrand would, but kind of dope.
Torbrand's obviously a little bit better with Chain Whirler just because it deals 3 rather than 2.
Yep.
But in the spots where basically it's like when it's dealing 2 damage, or when it's dealing 3 damage is when it becomes better than Torbrand. So kind of like you were saying with the burn spells and stuff like that.
I think another thing you can do is obviously the adventure creatures have potential, but there's some random like other cost reduction effects like Spectacle that we brought up. Those are ways to kind of cheat with this card, but there's also a spoiler card later that we're going to discuss that works really well with Chain Whirler anyway, that also has an odd CMC. So like maybe you get some super janky nonsense like that. I don't know. Like I love deck building stuff like that. But
definitely, a card like this is probably too slow for Modern, right?
Definitely 5-drops tend to not make the cut in Modern, and I don't think the payoff is good enough in a format where we already have Furnace of Wrath that doesn't really see any play. Being a creature and being an 8th card is relevant, but it is 5 mana. So I think we're mostly looking at Standard and Pioneer here.
Yeah. Well, Furnace of Wrath, it deals it to both players, right?
Yes.
So being able to only deal it to your opponent, like maybe, but like you were saying, being a 5-drop is probably going to not allow that to happen.
Yeah, one thing to note is this doesn't work super well with Mutavault or tokens because they have even CMC.
Because it's 0.
Yeah, so that may make like 2-color payoffs better than they otherwise would be. So I don't know. Cool. I'm super hyped about this card. I love it. So I'm glad.
And the cool thing is that you can have it be your companion, and you can put the other 3 into your deck, unlike the card that we're about to talk about.
Yes. Yeah, which is super dope. So the next one we're talking about, I think, has the potential to break certain formats, and this is one of the legacy cards that people are talking about in anything from D&T into Grixis Delver for like the more black heavy versions, all the way into something like Storm. People are talking about, and just Lures of the Dream Den. Now this is another companion creature like Obosh over here, but it has a little bit of a different deck building restriction that, as you mentioned before, you can't put this one in your deck and have it be your companion. So you kind of have to make the choice. And I really like that tension. Now, that brings up an interesting point for deck building of, do I want access to the effect multiple times in the game, or do I just want access to it the first time and take the free card? And, it's also possible that you play Lurrus in a deck that plays it and you put them in your deck and you play like a different companion card, and so you still have like that potential as well if you put it in your main deck. But I think this card has a ton of potential. Like 3 mana 3/2 lifelink is already a reasonable rate, but being able to cast a permanent spell CMC 2 or less from your graveyard every turn, most of competitive Magic involves spells with CMC 3 or less. So that stands to reason that 2 or less is also going to be really powerful. One of the instant applications I saw for this in Standard was in the Rakdos Sacrifice deck, where you don't even play it as a companion necessarily. Like you could, but you don't have to. You just throw it in your deck, and you can cast, if your opponent blows up your Witch's Oven, you can cast that. You can cast your Priest of Forgotten Gods. You can cast your Kroxa every turn from the graveyard. And that's pretty cool, I think.
Yeah, the fact that it's since a lot of these companion cards, or I think all of them, are the hybrid, it gives you a lot more implications to where maybe you put it in a deck that doesn't have white because you can just play it for the black.
Yep, and one thing that's pretty cool about this, which is part of the reason why we're talking about it so much in Legacy, is the deck building restriction only cares about permanent cards that cost 2 or less. You can still play Force of Will in your blue deck. Nick brought up a good point that in Pioneer, or Modern or whatever, you could play Collected Company, right?
Oh wow, that's pretty cool.
So yeah, and like this also, the cool thing with Lurus in Modern is if you play it with Collected Company, you can actually put it into play off Coco and then just start casting like your Vizier combo cards from Graveyard, and it doesn't require you to play black to do that because it's a white-black hybrid card.
Yeah, I was just about to say that I was thinking like what permanent cards 2 or less you actually care about, and the fact that like you can still play your Dota Druid, your Vizier, and like Ballista.
Yeah.
Basically, with this card, what would you basically be losing out on not being able to play?
Heliod. If it's your companion, but again, you don't need this as your companion necessarily.
Yeah.
Now this is a card that the Heliod decks want. They want that effect, but if you play Heliod, you can't play it as your companion. So you do have to recognize that that condition exists. Even in Pioneer, I kind of want to put this in my Heliod deck. Being able to cast Ballista if they kill it, or a Daxos, or even a Thraben Inspector, like, is pretty relevant. It's also a lifelinker, it's 2 devotion, stuff like that. It's also pretty reasonable in, say, Mono Black.
Yeah.
There's...
you get a ton of value from this card.
Yeah. It's good they restricted it to just once per turn, because it'd be absolutely bananas if it was anything less than once a turn. But there's some kind of cool cards. It's also permanent, so you have some implications where you could potentially cast like the Myers Grasp over and over, right? Like and just lock your opponent out of creatures like that. So
are there any like 1 or 2 mana like permanent value engines that you could think about that would be super cool with this card?
I mean, there's some weird stuff like Sinister Concoction, but off the top of my head, I can't really think of too many. But I thought about playing a janky deck with this in Pioneer with Vessel of Nascency and like trying to loop Vessel over and over. But you can cast a Thassa's Oracle if you wanted to. So I suppose there's some merit to that. But I think in the interesting thing that I alluded to before with Legacy. Is in Storm, oftentimes Storm and Legacy wants to be able to kill things like Narset, and other Planeswalkers can be very difficult, even something like a Jace. This is a creature that attacks, and so they're not super likely to be able to deal with it post-board, but it can also cast Lion's Eye Diamond from your graveyard.
Okay.
And that's really huge in Legacy Storm. Lion's Eye Diamond or Lotus Petal, so it can set up mana over and over for you, which I think is, has some application to it. So it can't let you play lands, only spells. But I still think that's yes, exactly. But I still think that's kind of cool. So
yeah, I mean, I think it'd be pretty broken if you could just like play a fetch land every turn with this card.
So one of the pet decks, I think that we may see this card actually be a companion in, is the Ors of Aras deck in Pioneer.
Okay.
So everything in that deck costs 2 or less.
That's true. That's pretty rad, actually.
Yeah, and you could just cast a Brain Maggot if they kill it again. But you also get to always have a creature in your opening hand. Now that's like a 17, 18 land deck, so like getting to 3 mana isn't super free. But hey, one of the ways that deck loses is if they just kill your first couple guys, and well, now you have Lurus that you can at least like get some stuff back from. So I think it's pretty cool in that deck. You could also play like 3 copies in your sideboard in that deck, companion one of them, and then board into 3 if you feel like you need to. So that's something you can do. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you basically just get to play like a 61st card for free game 1, and then depending. That's pretty cool, actually.
Yeah, so obviously this card goes super deep, right? One thing I was thinking about in Standard was Mono Black Devotion. So it has 2 Devotion pips for that. You would just play it in the main deck, but it can guarantee that you set up like Burglar Rat nonsense, or like Priest of Forgotten Gods. You can just like get that back. So there's a lot of like pretty cool things you can do with it. Nick actually messaged me, and he's like, you can use like Chromatic Star and Chromatic Sphere in Modern. And yeah, or like Mishra's Bauble or something. Like also this can cast Death Shadow. Now,
I think any way that you can get like repeated card draw, and just kind of like get advantage that way is gonna be pretty powerful.
Especially with something like Mishra's Bauble, where it's 0 mana to do it, right? So you play this,
Exactly.
and you immediately play Bauble, and even if they kill it, you're still going to draw your card for free off of it. That might be worth not being able to play something like Gurmag Angler or like Planeswalkers that cost 3 mana, right? So pretty cool, pretty cool.
It
Yeah.
definitely seems like there's a lot of play with a card like this.
Oh yeah, I think we'll see a ton of different decks utilizing this card. I think we could talk for hours about the potential implications, but we've got other cards to cover. But this card is one of my favorite cards in the set. Like so many interesting applications. I just want to see this card cast a Black Lotus. Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a card that would probably go in the Vintage Cube.
Definitely. Yep. All right, so the next one that we have is another legendary creature. There's actually a lot of them that are kind of pushed in this set, but this one's not actually a companion creature, and frankly, I'm not sure it necessarily makes the cut for a competitive quality card, but it's kind of cool, and I think it has enough reasonable play to it that it can kind of snowball out of control in certain archetypes, and it's Shovel, Bane of Monsters. So 2 mana 1/3 Death Touch isn't particularly exciting. Those cards never really see play outside of limited. But the ability to turn your removal spells into life gain and drawing a card, I think has enough application that we could see Shovel show up a little bit, maybe like post-board in Jund Sack Mirrors, or maybe a little bit in Pioneer in the Golgari deck, or maybe like Golgari Stompy or something, maybe a Coco deck. I think there's enough like ability to leverage removal spells with this card that maybe there's something you can do with it.
Yeah, the one thing that kind of gives me some pause is the fact that you still need this out on the battlefield in order for the bounty counters to have an effect.
Right.
So if you just and you also need it to survive to your turn. So you play on your turn 2, doesn't do anything, it's just a 1/3 with Death Touch, and then on your upkeep you can put a counter on something, and then hopefully you can kill it. But if they kill your guy in response, sure, you killed their thing, but you don't get to draw your card and gain the 3 life.
Yeah, that's a good point. Also, you can't load up their field with bounty counters, right? You can only have one at a time.
Exactly, because it's whenever a permanent control with the bounty counter dies, so it's not like for each bounty counter. That could be maybe kind of cool, where you put 2 on a thing and then you kill it, and then you get 6 life and 2 cards. Maybe, but that would probably be too broken.
Yeah. And I think that's probably why they put the restriction. I think it's pretty cool flavor wise, and it does kind of work by I play this as a 1/3, my opponent doesn't attack into it, I put a bounty counter on their blocker, and they can never block this profitably. But it's a 1/3, so you don't really get to leverage that too much.
Yeah. Maybe if it was a 3/1, you could kind of get a little bit aggressive with it.
Yeah.
But then it can be kind of squishy, so.
So I could actually see this in Modern a little bit in Jund, because having a 1/3 is a lot more valuable than having a 1 toughness creature, and it also can give you a little bit of an edge in some of the lower removal spell matchups. Like maybe you have to manage a big board state because you've got cards like Dreadbore, Lightning Bolt, Fatal Push, and it even triggers if you kill an opponent's Planeswalker like a Renin 6. So
yeah.
I think maybe and you have a ton of removal in those decks, which is really important.
It's true, and it's a card advantage engine that, like Bob, that doesn't hurt you. It kind of helps you survive.
Right. And
so
it does, yeah. I think I could see it seeing play a little bit as a 1 or 2 of alongside Renin 6. It's this grindy card advantage engine. Now, obviously, it's better when your opponent's playing creatures or planeswalkers you can kill, but the sequence of this into Liliana of the Veil is pretty sick.
That's true.
So
that is very true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in the fact of decks where you're just trying to 1-for-1 your opponent over and over again, something like this can kind of turn your 1-for-1s into 2-for-1s. So maybe it's a little bit better in Modern than I'm thinking of for something like Standard.
Yeah, I'm not sure it'll make the cut in Standard or Pioneer, but I think the main value it would have in Pioneer is being a 1/3 Death Touch is actually a relevant stat line right now. like being able to brick wall like aggro creatures and stuff like that.
Yeah, like maybe you would play this in like Sultai Delirium or something like that.
Yeah, you'd have to play more removal, I think. But there is a green-black Delirium deck that actually plays a bunch of removal that I could see that in, where like they've got Tireless Tracker this and a bunch of Murderous Riders, and like going this into Murderous Rider, like maybe that's enough to justify this card as like a 2 of or something.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, it also mitigates a little bit of the life loss, which is kind of cool. But
yeah,
yeah, and so I don't know. I think it's probably just a little bit too slow in general, but I think there's enough reasonable play to it that maybe we'll see it pop up as like a 1 of here and there.
Yeah, would it have been too good if it was at your end step you put the bounty counter on it?
I think so. Then it lets you like immediately get value off of like Fatal Push with it, and I think like. Sure, it still gives your opponent the window to kill it with their own like Fatal Push in response, but I think in general with these types of snowbally mechanics, I'm more of a fan of cards that encourage you to play your removal spells at different times. Like normally in Magic, we have mechanics that encourage people to do what they should already be doing, right? Like Flash, for example, cast it on your opponent's end step, stuff like that, which is generally you should be waiting to the last possible moment to do your stuff. Shovel actually encourages you to do stuff on your own turn after you've triggered the ability because you don't want your opponent to untap and kill him in response. So I actually think that tension is necessary to justify this type of snowbally effect at 2 mana.
For sure.
Yeah. Alright. So the next one we have is, kind of another one of these cycle of legendary creatures. It's the humans are really unique and interesting in this set. I know we talked a little bit about some of the human stuff with Dire Tactics before, but this one also has multi-format application, and it's actually the type of human payoff we've typically seen before in Magic, but it has a unique twist on it. So, General Kudro also gives you the ability to convert your humans that you've gone wide with into removal spells for some bigger creatures, which I think is pretty on flavor for the set. But the main value is he gives a lot of these creature decks that just so happen to play humans, like Tireless Tracker, or even humans in Modern with Champion the Parish and Noble Hierarch. You can kind of get a Scavenging Ooze type effect in the main deck. By stapling it onto one of your lords. So, while I don't think this card really meshes super flavorfully or is a great standalone hit, I think it has a lot of synergy application and fills just a unique enough role that I think we're going to see this as at least a 2 of in multiple decks.
Yeah, I mean, it also deals with Uro, which is kind of a big problem right now.
Right.
in whether it's on the field or in the graveyard, which is kind of cool.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. One of the ways that Uro buries you, even if you exile it, is they still gain life and they still get to draw a card, but he does pump up your field, so you can also mitigate the life gain off of Uro as well. But if you don't deal with the Uro in their graveyard, they're just going to get the 6/6 anyway. And a similar thing can be said for Kroxa. But this also gives you access in Modern, for example. It gives humans the ability to fight, some random dredge creatures. Maybe you hit, their Stinkweed Imp and they don't get to actually dredge that turn, or you hit a Life from the Loam to shut off stuff. There's a lot of yeah, exactly, like a Conflagrate. There's a lot of cool things you can do with it. It kind of reminds me of Kunuros from Theros, the Hound, where it's sure, the card isn't great on its own, but there's enough positive synergy aspects that I think these types of cards are really interesting when they produce them. It's also great that they're legendary, because we don't really want 2 of those effects on the field at a time.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I'm pretty interested to see how this affects Standard. Now, there's not a ton of humans right now, and there's not a great black-white X mid-range deck necessarily, but something that's kind of cool in Standard and potentially in Pioneer is Hero of Precinct 1 with this card. So, so Hero is a human, but Hero also makes humans, or does he make soldiers? Humans, right?
Let me check. I think it's
Yeah,
humans.
yeah, but like so, it's a multicolor card that triggers hero. It also like exiles Uro and well, less like you could potentially exile Cauldron Familiar um, from their graveyard as well,
Yeah,
or like
the
Cruxa or
hero
something.
does make human tokens.
That
So
seems great to me. Like,
yeah, like maybe like it makes Esper Hero a little bit more viable,
yeah,
just because you're able to deal with some different accesses that the Dex and Standard are fighting on right now.
yeah. I mean, Elite Guard Mage is also a human.
Yeah, true.
If we extend that to Pioneer, we've got access to more 1 and 2 mana playable humans, right? In Pioneer, but we also have Hostage Taker potentially in Pioneer. That's also a human. So I think there's some cool things we can do with this, and it kind of makes me want to revisit Hero of Precinct 1 a little bit more. Like that damage swing is pretty insane, right? So
Yeah,
you just you hit your opponent for 3 on the turn that you play the general, and then you untap and you hit them for 8, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah.
that's
I mean,
pretty insane.
you go from 2 power to 8 power, which is pretty insane.
Yeah, that's pretty ridiculous. Like you can also play Lurus, I guess, if you like wanted to, but you probably don't play too many 2 CMC
Yeah,
cards.
and
But
it also gives you a ton of something to do with all of your your human tokens that are left over.
yep,
When you cast a bunch of the spells rather than just being able to chump block, you can kind of like start killing like maybe some big flyers or something like that.
yeah, that's one of the drawbacks and kind of why when we were testing really hard with War of the Spark, when we were really trying to make a Esper hero work, was we played cards like Bantu, right? Like where you
Hmm.
needed something that could turn your extra human tokens into value in games where pressuring your opponent's life total didn't matter, and being
Yeah,
able to kill, I don't know, like an Uro or a Croxa, or killing any random big creature is pretty, it is a pretty cool way to use it, but it also lets you turn all your excess human tokens that you generate later into exiling a card from graveyard, because it doesn't say non-token human, it's any human.
yeah,
So you get to like kind of shut off your opponent's ability to ever utilize their graveyard if they don't have a way to remove the general. So pretty
yeah,
sweet, I think.
yeah. And the fact that it's kind of like on your plan A of like going wide and making a bunch of humans, and also kind of has like it's a sideboard card that you don't have to have in your sideboard, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, like I think mid-range decks in general need cards like this that support an aggressive game plan that have utility outside of the aggressive game plan. Like, it's not a horrible card on its own as a 3 mana 3/3 that exiles like an Uro or a Croxa. Even like exile in Pioneer, exiling, I don't know, the opt that they played so they have to delay their dig through time for a turn. That kind of stuff adds up, these little incremental things.
Yeah,
So yeah, I'd be interested to see how exactly this shakes out in formats like Standard and Pioneer. So the formats that don't have like a dedicated human deck or human presence in the metagame, I'd be really interested to see how this affects those.
yeah. Like making the inverter math on when they can kind of like go off is kind
Yeah.
of cool.
It also lets
Um,
you kill Inverter and kill their Jace, right? Like you sack like 2 tokens or whatever, blow up their 6/6, and like now you can kill their Jace. So maybe you can like set up weird things like that. I don't know.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. All right. So the next card we have, I don't really have a ton to say about this card, but and I really don't care for it that much. But typically cards like this have been at least playable in the past, and enough people have really talked about it that I think it's worth going over a little bit. And that's Fiend Artisan, which is one of the hybrid cards in Ikoria, and 2 mana 1/1, as we've talked about before, not great. But if it's a creature that grows every turn or grows really quickly, kind of in an analogous way as the Sprite Dragon, but on theme with black and green, like maybe there's a lot of potential there. But it's also kind of like a semi toolboxy effect. So it's not quite like a birthing pod because you need to actually sink that much mana in, and
Yeah,
you have to sack another creature. But this is another card that's maybe appealing in like a Cauldron Familiar deck. Like you can play Familiar on 1, this on 2. You can untap on 3, sack Familiar, grab like maybe like another copy of Fiend Artisan, or you can grab like a Priest of Forgotten Gods or something. Like I think there's a lot of the scalability of this card. It's also 2 black pips for a mono black devotion in standard, while also being able to work with Nightmare Shepherd to go get something else. And we had a deck in standard that used Vanifar, that actually, if you untapped with Vanifar, you could just kill your opponent by getting Hyrax Tower Scouts and like Spark Doubles and stuff like that to kill your opponent with Grey Merchants. Well, now we have Fiend Artisan, which we can kind of do in a similar way. So, and it also has applications in Pioneer because of Satyr Wayfinder, and maybe there's some stuff you can do with it in Modern, though you probably don't really play it for either of the effects necessarily. But again, you can kind of get this toolboxy effect where you could maybe just find your Vizier and kill your opponent, or sure, it's limited by sorcery speed, but you could still get something like a Reclamation Sage, or like a Thalia, or I don't know. There's a lot of like interesting things you can do with this type of effect, but it is really mana intensive, so I'm not sure if it quite makes the cut.
Yeah, like maybe it's better if you're kind of like trying to work more towards the +1/+1 for each creature card in your graveyard, and you're kind of like a self-mill deck that maybe has like some sort of like combo finish.
Yeah.
To be able to like fetch something out late when the power doesn't really matter as much.
I mean, I know you and I always have a feeling that we always want to test and try and make black-green undergrowth work in every possible standard format we can.
Yeah, maybe there's something here.
Yeah, like I think I think possibly the Nick messaged me and he's like, well, like I think some decks are probably just going to see it as Tarmogoyf, and I think that's a good point. That was kind of the point I was trying to get across with the Satyr Wayfinder, right? Is that if you played in Satyr Wayfinder decks, you have a creature to sack to it to go get another creature, like another copy of itself, which is a pretty sick interaction. And Satyr Wayfinder fuels itself, so you probably like want to pair it with Satyr Wayfinder and something like Pioneer. But it's also like, if this were a card that were legal in Hogak, we would play it in Hogak, right? In Modern, but you could play it in like Crabvine, right? Which like sacking, you can sack your Narcomoeba and get anything you really want, right? So you could grab another Hedron Crab or something like that. So it's
Yeah, I guess you could maybe like, so you play this on like turn 2, and then you play like Wayfinder on turn 3, and then maybe you're like hitting in for some damage, and then the next turn maybe you're hitting into so it'd be 4, and then you'd be finding like a 3-drop or something like that.
Yeah, I mean the other line too is you could play this on 2 after like a 1-drop or whatever. You could choose to not attack with it, and you could just sack your 1-drop, get another copy of it. If that 1-drop was a Stitcher Supplier, your opponent's probably just going to die. But if it were like Hedron Crab in Modern, they're probably dead, right? But you could also just untap with this on 3, play a 1-drop, sack the 1-drop, get another 1-drop, right? Like that's something that you can also do.
Yeah, which is pretty cool.
And that's why I think the Narcomoeba line is pretty gross, because in Pioneer Dredge, we've seen cards like Deathrite Shaman potentially make the cut, but this probably like supplants that type of card, because like imagine, for instance, you play a Stitcher Supplier on 1 and you like a Magical Christmas Land into a Narcomoeba. You play this on 2. And then turn 3, you can just untap and just sack whatever you want, and like the world is your oyster, right? So like the ability to like for this to find other copies of itself, to then find another copy of itself, is pretty sweet. It's also kind of cool with Bridge from Below. So you can like sack a creature, get another copy of itself, have a zombie which you can sacrifice the next turn, like and set up shenanigans like that. So I don't know necessarily how to evaluate this card exactly, but I suspect it's just playable enough. These cards are always really tough to evaluate, though.
Well, Bridge is banned in Modern, right?
Oh, you're right. We can do it in Legacy. Easy. Yeah. I mean,
which it's probably too slow for Legacy, though, right?
I mean,
you'd probably rather just play like a Delve creature or something like that.
Well, That's true. It's also like a 2 mana like 12/12 in Legacy.
Yeah.
But granted, you could play a 2 mana 20/20 and it isn't necessarily good enough in Legacy, as evidenced by Merit Lage.
Exactly.
So the I think the coolest application for this, I think, is probably going to be in like Kitchen Finks type decks, where like you have a lot of utility creatures. You also like creatures end up in your graveyard all the time, but you can play weird utility creatures, right? You can play like Hex Parasite. You can play like Giver of Runes and stuff like that. In addition to playing Mana Dorks too, that you also have as fodder. That was typically the play pattern we saw in a lot of Birthing Pod decks. Was you played a bunch of Mana Dorks and then you would play your Engine card. And then you would like use the Mana Dork to field that engine card, and then also play another threat and like help you double spell. I think in Standard, the most interesting application for this is most likely going to be in like the food decks, because it gives you another grindy card advantage engine. It is vulnerable to Mayhem Devil, though, in Standard, because a lot of times you won't necessarily have a creature in your graveyard yet, or they can like, or this will be like a 2/2, and they can like crack crack something, sack something at like sack of food, kill this, but you know, the ability to find toolbox cards, I think, is pretty dope. Like a Reclamation Sage, or I guess you could like turn your Mana Dork into a Tireless Tracker or something.
Yeah,
like,
I mean that's kind of why I was thinking of it in like maybe a Sultai Delirium
yeah.
show. Just because you play a lot of one-ofs and being able to fetch them out when you want to is pretty cool. Kind of gives you like a creature traverse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, you could play like you could play like CDC's Faithful or something. It's like a 1-drop you can sacrifice to this, but it's also a 1-drop unsummon you can tutor out with this. Like it's a 1-drop utility creature. Yeah, I mean there's enough like cool things. Maybe you play Gilded Goose with this, because you can like sack the food to generate mana and then use that mana to sack the Gilded Goose. So it's like, kind of like fulfilling the Mana Dork role anyway. Yeah, super dope card. You can also, if you somehow have enough mana, you can, and I guess you can actually stack the triggers. You could play a Cruxa or an Uro and sack that to this. No, I guess you can't. Sorcery speed, but never mind.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, so they planned for that. That's good.
Yeah.
But you can still do enough cool things, right? Where like you get value off your comes into play effect, and then you like sack it, and you like do something else. Like these toolboxy cards generally are just playable enough. I think the biggest thing holding back a card like this is very similar to what holds back Vanifar, which is they're generally pretty mana intensive. Vanifar requires 4 mana up front. This requires, at least 2 to 3 mana, which is mostly going to be your entire turn.
Yeah, it definitely seems like where this card maybe fits best is like you were saying, where you just go Supplier on 1 and hook 3 creatures over, then you just play a 2 mana 4/4.
Yeah, like, the ability to turn your Stitcher Suppliers into Tarmogoyfs by finding more copies of Fiend Artisan, while it does slow you down in terms of velocity, it gives you the ability to play a little bit more of a fair plan. But you can also just turn your 1-drops into Scavenging Ooze too, I guess, if you needed to. Or like, as you'd mentioned before, like, Sultai plays a lot of toolboxy creatures. Now, the current Sultai lists in Pioneer tend to not play as many toolboxy creatures now as they play like Planeswalkers and removal spells and stuff like that, but you could play like you could go back to playing a Brain Maggot, you could like get a Jacerin's Prodigy, you could play again the Tireless Tracker, like in Modern you can sack a creature and get an Eternal Witness for like a value loop thing. So you can also, like, I think Nightmare Shepherd is a really cool card with this as well, because you can like sack a creature and kind of get 2 creatures and kind of snowball from there a little bit. So it's also, if you have Fiend Artisan plus Nightmare Shepherd, which one are they going to kill, right?
Exactly.
If you untap with that, like, if they kill your Fiend Artisan, you just exile it and you make a Fiend Artisan, and then you just can sack the Nightmare Shepherd, and you can just find whatever you want anyway, like another Nightmare Shepherd or whatever. Like, if they kill your Nightmare Shepherd, you can just sack another creature to get it again. So that's kind of a cool interaction. It also can find you Grey Merchant, and it has 2 black pips, so there's some like cool things, I think. Also, two green pips comes up, so we could see this in like potentially like the Burning Tree Devotion decks, like sure, this card's really, 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 really bad in those decks, like
Mhm.
as a whole, but like there could be enough like justification to running Seder Wayfinder as a way to find like Nykthos, and like you can also just like cash in creatures for toolbox. Like maybe it gives you a reason to kind of have this as like a sideboard plan. So I don't know, like
Yeah.
it's also kind of like a Tarmogoyf, right? So
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, like maybe you play with like Glowspore Shaman too. If we're talking like standard, maybe.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you've got Glowspore, you've got a couple, you've got Mire Triton, um,
Scavenging Vulture too.
yeah, the Gorging Vultures, yeah.
Hmm.
I mean that mills four, that's a good amount.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and in other formats we've got like Grizzly Salvage, right? Stuff
Yeah.
like that. That was these types of cards have typically seen play in standard formats where we have those mill cards. So I
Hmm.
could see that being good enough.
Yeah, like maybe you're playing like Deathless Knight too, because it triggers off like Mire Triton and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it's also like pips, like you were saying for Grey Merchant.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, maybe there's something here.
Yeah. I mean, at the very least, it's another cool card I can throw into my janky Feasting Troll King food decks.
Exactly.
So, which I know you're always a fan of losing to those Dylan
Yeah.
decks in testing, but
I mean, thankfully there's no more Oko to be able to
yeah,
wreck the.
yeah. I mean, we had a version where we were just splashing blue for Oko, so
Yeah.
that was how stupid that was. But yeah. All right, so I guess we'll move on to the next one. It's another one of the legendaries, Riel the Everwise. This one I mostly put in here because of potential legacy and vintage applications, but I think it also has enough potential in modern and pioneer that it could open up archetypes like Arclight Phoenix again,
Hmm.
which we haven't really seen in quite a while in either of those formats. Now, in modern, we saw the banning of Faithless Looting, which is obviously one of the best cards to play with this. Um,
Hmm.
but that was like the biggest hurdle to modern Arclight Phoenix. But in terms of Pioneer, it was mostly the printing of Uro and some of these other cards that kind of invalidated Arclight as an archetype. So that like maybe a value engine like this it is potentially enough. So the idea behind this card is you could use you could use something like Is It Charm to suddenly generate card advantage in a way that you wouldn't ordinarily be able to do. And that's something that's kind of cool. Now, we don't
Yeah.
have like great discard spells, but even in standard, we have Merchant of the Veil. So you could potentially play this on 4 and like immediately like get some value off of it. Which is kind of cool, I
Hmm.
think. Or even something like Lightning Axe. Like playing this on 4, okay, I'll play this, I'll Lightning Axe your guy, I'll draw a card. Like, that's pretty good, I think.
Yeah, and the fact that it's on each turn, meaning that
Right.
you can like do it on your turn and on your opponent's turn, is kind of
Yeah.
cool. Like I guess like you just have to make sure that a secondary ability is good enough to warrant you playing it, so you're not playing something like a Crackling Drake or something like that.
Yeah.
Because when this card doesn't have the evasion, you really need to have like the card advantage side of it to kind of like make up for that.
Yeah, I mean, the one of the things we were talking about in Legacy and Vintage is Lion's Eye Diamond.
Hmm.
So you just discard your hand, get 3 mana,
Yeah,
and then you draw that same amount of cards anyway. Um,
turning it into like a wheel for
yeah,
yourself, which is kind of cool.
yeah, a wheel that like kind of refunds you mana.
Yeah.
The other thing you can do too is in Vintage you can actually just play wheel effects with it. Like blue
Hmm.
red is already like pretty popular and the mana's like good enough. In Legacy we also have access to both Faithless Looting and um, is it Curious Study, where it's like one blue mana
Yeah.
Faithless Looting. So
Is it Careful Study?
Careful Study, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So and like so there's a lot of like cool things you can do with this. Like one thing that I thought that was like kind of dope was you could play like some free discard outlets like Phantasmagorian and like
Hmm.
maybe like if you play this and like if you play this in Dredge and you like discard your hand to Phantasma, like you discard 3 cards to Phantasmagorian, well now you're gonna draw 3 cards and trigger a Stinkweed Imp. So
Yeah.
like I think there's some decks where you don't ever need to untap with this to
Mm-hmm.
win. Even in non-legacy formats where you just play this, you immediately draw 3 cards off your Phantasmagorian, and you dredge over like your whole deck.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's kind of cool. Like Nick messaged me. He's like, well, you could play Dangerous Wager too, which is a card he and I have been experimenting with in Modern, and that's 2 mana, discard your hand, draw 2 cards.
Yeah.
Which is like kind of cool on its own because you can just play that when you're empty-handed and draw 2. But Riel like makes it even better. But I kind of want to explore the Phantasmagorian part myself. It's kind of like this kind of becomes like an Oxyvagonus in that
Yeah.
sense. Yeah, I mean I'm not sold that this card will see play in Legacy, Modern, or Vintage, but I think there's enough like obviously Lion's Eye Diamond is a broken card, but I think there's enough like effects in Magic that make discarding a good thing. I mean, even Burning Inquiry with this card, right? Like
Oh
it,
yeah.
like that's super fucking
That's
dumb.
yeah. Draw 3, discard 3 randomly, draw 3. Like that's pretty insane.
Yeah, like like it gives you a reason to play blue in Hollow One, right? So
Yeah. Like I guess you just have to make sure that you have enough like instant and sorcery cards, hopefully, to make this into a threat by itself as well.
I mean, how big does this really need to be for it to matter? A 2/3?
Yeah. I mean,
I
which is
mean,
probably like definitely
if
doable.
if we're not talking about standard, it seems very easy, even in decks that don't play a ton of instants and sorceries, to actually just make this thing huge. Like
Yeah.
Burning Inquiry is going to make it a 1 power, but typically those decks play Lightning Bolt and Goblin Lore anyway. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so like I don't know,
Like
maybe.
yeah, Grixis Hollow one.
Yeah, like I mean, the mana's good enough in Modern that you could just play this as like your only blue card, right?
Yeah,
Like,
it's very true.
yeah,
And the fact that it's each turn means that you can like save your Street Wraith and discard it on their turn to draw 2 cards, which is kind of cool.
yep. I mean, if you play it on your own turn, and you haven't discarded a card yet, you can just Street Wraith to draw 2 there as well. Like,
Exactly.
Insolent Neonate is another like cycling discard effect that I could see it working with. But yeah, I mean, we've already seen Edge of Autumn as another fringe cycling card that's seen play anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I could see playing Riel with like 4 Street Wraith, um, and like 1 Edge of Autumn or something like that, um, which is like
Yeah,
kind of
definitely.
cool. Nick brought up that Collective Brutality is pretty nuts with
Mm.
this card, and that's a good point. Like because the Escalate is all discarding at once, you actually draw a card for each card you've discarded due to the Escalate. So you kind of
Oh,
just
that's
get to
pretty
do all
cool.
the modes. Yeah, that's pretty cool. It also clears the way for Riel too, if that's what you need. So
That's
yeah,
true.
yeah.
Yeah, so it definitely seems like Grixis is probably the best home for a card like this.
Yeah, or like in a dredge type shell where you have like Conflagrate and Phantasmagorian
Yeah.
to make work. But you really can't play fair with this card. I think I'm not convinced that you should be looking at the instant and sorcery part as much as the discarding part. Which
Yeah,
is
that makes sense.
yeah, which is why if I were to play Arclight in Pioneer, I might play one of this in my list
Mm-hmm.
over like a Royal Scions or something like that. Um,
Sure.
just because like the interaction with Is It Charm is like pretty good and Lightning Axe, but I think in general you want to be a little more unfair than that. But and Lightning Axe brings up a good point in the fact that the Hollow One decks also play Lightning Axe.
Yeah.
So, we've got Lightning Axe, we've got Burning Inquiry, we've got Street Wraith, we've got Goblin Lore. I think that's probably enough to justify like playing this now. 3 mana's a lot, but even with Street Wraith, it's as you mentioned before, that's pretty insane, right? Like,
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
know,
obviously, like it makes you like it. A card like this, is it better to like wait to discard your Street Wraith till turn 3 to like draw the 2 cards, or like do you just want the velocity on turns 1 and 2? I don't know, but maybe a
right,
card like
right.
this makes you have those interesting decision points that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. Like, determining if I play this on 3 and I immediately cycle Street Wraith and draw 2, like the value in that is in case I draw another Street Wraith, right? And then I can cycle it on their turn. So yeah, I mean, like, but then that makes like your hollow one turn slower. Like if I'm playing this on 3, I'm not playing a hollow one that turn, right? Unless like my turn 1 was like instant neonate and I have like double Street Wraith, and then like then I can like then that's worth not playing hollow one because I can play this draw 2 on my opponent's turn, draw 2 on my turn, draw 2 again. And like that's probably enough to justify not playing it, but yeah, like it's probably more of like a 4-drop than it really is. I think you have to have a Street Wraith or like a Phantasmagorian or a Lion's Eye Diamond or something that discards for free in order, I think, to justify playing this card. But it's probably not a 4 of, but it's I really want to play a lot of different cards with this and see. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yep. All right. So the next one up is Fertilid, which is actually a reprint from Morningtide. And this one I don't really have on here because I'm not really expecting this card to see much competitive play, but it is now new to Pioneer, and it's in the same standard format as Omnath. Well, itself, it is an elemental, so I just wanted to put this on here because you kind of have that engine now, right? So a land comes into play, all right, I'll trigger my Omnath, all right, well, obviously I'm going to target the Fertilid, and you kind of have like an engine now, which is kind of cool. So, yeah, that's really the only reason I put this on there.
Are there any other, besides Omnath, in Standard that you'd want to be like comboing with this card?
I don't think so. I think it's pretty much just Omnath that's like kind of cool with it. It also like requires you to play a lot of basics in your deck because you need that engine to start working. But yeah, I mean, I think if I were to play like Temur Elementals, I'd probably play like 2 Fertilid in it or whatever. It's kind of a way to like get some value in the late game, but you do have to play more. You have to play more basics, which has its own share of drawbacks. But I'm not really sure that there's anything else that necessarily synergizes with this. There's like a smattering of cards that put +1/+1 counters on stuff, but there's nothing super degenerate you can do with Fertilid. But it does ramp you a lot. It's kind of like you can play like this card tends to be pretty good and limited in general because it's like sure 3 mana 2/2 is nothing like great, but it's a body that also can like ramp and fix you. So in a lot of ways it's kind of like an explosive vegetation that also gave you a blocker. So this card's already modern legal, and I'm not and I'm not really expecting it to see play in Pioneer, but I just wanted to like highlight how cool it is with Omnath. So I just want to do that once. Like that seems super fun. So
yeah, I mean, like a way of deck thinning and makes like the cards that you're drawing a little bit more impactful is kind of cool for sure.
Yep. You can also just like kill it by removing a bunch, and like that's enough. Oh, Nick jokingly sent Course of Crufix plus Heliod.
Oh yeah.
I mean, true. You can get them off of Coco, I guess. Like that's also something you can do, but yeah, I mean, kind of cool.
Definitely.
Yeah. Oh, also should be noted, it says target player searches, so you can make your opponent search their deck for a basic land if you want to. Yes. So I'll tuck your guy with Teferi, and then I'll remove my counters from my Fertilid.
Yeah.
Like
that's kind of funny.
Yep. All right, so the next couple ones we have up aren't really as format impacting, I think, as prior cards, but they're more really good, solid role players that we'll see throughout Magic's history. So this first one up is Wilt, which is basically just a naturalize effect, but it has cycling. And we've seen a lot of naturalize effects before, like Unravel the Ether sees play right now because of Heliod.
Well, Dissenter's Deliverance was just artifact, right?
Yes.
So the fact that this is able to kill enchantments is a huge
it's I think it's a really huge upgrade. This is also strictly better naturalized too. So, and is it necessarily better than Nature's Claim in Eternal formats or Croson Grip? I think that really depends on what your deck is trying to do, but I think this is a little bit of an upgrade for something like Lotus Field in Pioneer, or the Turbo Emrakul deck, where when you don't have targets, you want to be able to dig for your pieces.
Yeah.
And that was one of the main reasons why Dissenter's Deliverance saw play was, in something like Infect in Modern, was because sometimes you wanted to blow something up, but you also wanted the opportunity to cash in this card for later. Um,
Yeah, that makes
so
a lot of sense.
yeah, I mean, we I really like how Wizards has been printing a lot more cards that like are destroy target artifact or enchantments, but have something else going on, which is pretty dope.
Yeah, I mean, let's just basically slap cycling on an old Magic card and call it a day, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's always a good way to get players to look twice at a card, and cycling, obviously has other implications as well.
Definitely.
So these next ones here, these aren't actually specifically necessarily the cards that I think are worth talking about, but it's more of highlighting the unique mechanic that they have, which is cycling one. So when we had talked about Riel, we obviously looked at how powerful a card like Street Wraith could be with it. So free cycling is obviously great, but cycling for one mana is also pretty appealing. We've seen modern archetypes like Living End be built off of cards that cycle for one mana, and we've also seen things like New Perspectives as a combo deck in Standard before that wanted a critical mass of cycling effects that had to play some frankly awkward win cons at times. And
Mm-hmm.
now all these decks get access to more card selection and more potential cycling effects. But the other cool thing is now every color can have access to a cantrip of sorts. You can always, if you are a deck that just wants to churn through its deck and you don't have cantrips available in your color, you could always just play a mediocre cycling card as like the way that some decks play Crash through. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so
Hmm.
we see that there's a white one drop that has cycling one whenever you cycle a card for the first time in a turn, put a plus one counter on it. Now, normally I wouldn't play that card, but say I'm this a white deck and I kind of want a little bit of card selection, like Thraben and Inspector, but obviously I can't play 8 of those.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I play 4 of this because my plan is to cycle them, when I have excess mana, but when I don't, I have kind of an aggressive game plan. So, I think these open up a lot of play. The one I'm particularly excited about is Go for Blood,
Mm-hmm.
because this is something that I think could see play in something like Hollow One or other decks in Pioneer and Modern, where you kind of want to discard more cards and you want to draw more cards, but you also kind of want removal. And like, while this is nowhere near as good as Lightning Axe, like maybe it's like a fifth Lightning Axe, like but it is another one mana cantrip that helps you fuel your discard outlets. So you know,
Would you ever play like an off-color cycling one generic card in your deck?
in limited, I would
Yeah, but outside of limited, probably not.
not unless I think there would be times in which I would. Um, so I think the reasons in which I would actually is if it's a way for me to get delirium in decks that otherwise have a hard time putting, say, an enchantment into my graveyard. I might
Mm-hmm.
play it there because it's a cantrip that helps you feel delirium, which is pretty cool about these one mana cycling cards. There's very few creatures or sorceries that I can in some color combinations that I can pay one mana, put it in my graveyard and draw a card. We see Crash Through in red, but white
Yeah.
does. If you're like a white green deck that wants to play Traverse the Ulenwald, you may have a hard time getting certain cards into your graveyard, and so I might in those types of decks, or if I'm say like a white combo deck or whatever. And I don't have access to blue for whatever reason, I might play off color cycling cards just to have a density of cantrips. So I think there's like some decks where I would, um, but like generally speaking, I'm not looking to. But there are enough cycling ones in every color that I don't think you'll really have to make that choice too much.
For sure.
Um, The yeah, so like that's kind of like the Cycling 1 cards. There's actually like a lot of them in the set. But like, they it's kind of like one of the default mechanics of the set. So there's actually like a lot of different ones specifically that like we could talk about, but um,
it's just more of the fact that there are generic cycling cards.
Yeah, like the mechanic is super new. So, in terms of 1 mana cycling, like that's not something we've really seen before.
Yeah, because before it was a lot of 2 generic, right?
Yes, or 1 colored mana. We typically don't see anything else.
Gotcha.
So, yeah. All right. So moving on to the next one, it's one of our. It's one of the foreign cards. It's not actually in. It wasn't spoiled or leaked in English, but it's a card that I think is worthy of discussion. So it's this one here in Russian. The Devouring Bite isn't really the name, but we'll see what it actually ends up being. It's a sorcery. As additional cost, reveal a creature card from your hand. This spell deals damage to target creature or planeswalker equal to the revealed card's power. Now, I'm excited about this card, obviously. I may be a little bit biased from Pioneer in the fact that I play Turbo Emrakul, and that's one of my pet decks. And obviously, revealing an Uro or an Emrakul with this is going to kill almost everything in the format. It's also like a sorcery, and it doesn't require you to have the creature in play, which is pretty huge. But, it's also super unique for a green card. We don't typically see green decks have access to like 3 mana destroy a creature or planeswalker, right? Like that's not something green gets. So them getting access to it, like I can play this in Stompy in Pioneer and reveal a Rotting Regisaur from my hand, or even in Standard. I can do similar things, right? Like I can play this in my Bats deck and I can reveal an Uro and I can kill your Teferi or your Nissa. And, so I think there's some really cool things you can do with this. You could also play it potentially in, like, certain versions of Tron that are more creature-heavy and reveal, like, a Thragtusk can kill their whatever, right? Like...
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty similar to something like Titan's Presence, but being able to kill a Planeswalker seems pretty huge.
And not having a colorless restriction, too, is, like, substantial, I think. Yeah, like, it also, like, can deal, like... One of the things too is like, sure, it's a sorcery speed, but the ability to like play it in a bunch of different decks, I think is why like Titan's Presence was a card that's probably the most similar to this, right? But I think they actually are like very fundamentally different because Titan's Presence forces you to be a specific like deck, right?
It's not green creature, right?
It's just creature. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
It definitely seems like a solid role player that maybe your green decks wouldn't have access to before. Being able to deal with problematic creatures or planeswalkers.
Yeah, I mean that's not something that green gets, and arguably that's not something that green should get. But Wizards likes to try and experiment with giving colors access to things that typically are very hard for them to answer, and I think one of those. Is shown in the way that Wizards is exploring having black make players sacrifice enchantments. In this way, white is getting some experimental stuff as well, and green is getting the ability to like deal more direct damage than ordinarily would. Still tied to creatures, of course, but so this is a way for them to experiment with that. This is actually kind of similar to Beast Within, or like Song of the Dryad, in that it's like a way to answer multiple different permanents. But I don't think we've seen anything as like quite like this in green before, because Song of the Dryads and Beast Within are both very green drawbacks for your opponent, right? One gives them a land, the other one gives them a 3/3. This doesn't give the opponent anything, right?
So, and it is 3 mana, and it requires you to have a creature in hand, so there are some times where it's just not going to do anything, but when it is good, it's going to be very good.
Yep. And that's kind of the cool thing, I think, in Pioneer for this card, is because Uro and Traverse are so good together, you can kind of just shoehorn this in with those cards. And you can just Traverse for whatever you want and cast this on 4 and kill whatever you want.
Exactly.
And that comes up a lot. But also, like, in Pioneer, you're almost always going to have a creature in hand, unless you're like a Rotting Regisaur deck. And like, Uro is also just just a good card on its own anyway. So,
Yeah.
like, I think Pioneer's probably like a good home for this, even though 3 mana sorcery speed removal isn't great, but it's unique enough in decks that want access to this effect. Like, this is a hero's downfall in certain decks that don't have access to that type of effect.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, like maybe in like the mono green ramp deck in Pioneer, you're playing this instead of like a spatial contortion or something like that.
Oh, absolutely. We've got Cavalier, we've got Worldbreaker, Ulamog,
Yeah.
all of that type of stuff. Like, yeah, like it seems phenomenal in that deck. Like, I think it's pretty good even in Sultai, but obviously our deck, Turbo Emrakul, like probably plays 4 of this card in the 75.
Yeah.
Like, it's just your best removal no matter what. So, yeah, I mean,
makes you a little bit less reliant on Brazen Bar, which is kind of nice.
Yes.
Whereas like you're just kind of like prolonging the problem rather than actually dealing with it.
Yeah, like, now 3 mana matters a lot for that type of deck, but it might be worth just only playing 1 Brazen Borrower at that point.
Yeah.
And you might only need it as a toolboxy effect.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably best as a sideboard card, though, right? Talking about the Devouring Bite.
Yes, that's generally how I would see it. Like, I could see like 1 in the main deck or whatever, but I think a card like this is mostly going to be sideboard, except like maybe the mono green ramp deck plays it main deck or whatever. But
yeah, just the fact that it's kind of like sideboard games are going to be a little bit slower, so boarding in your 3 mana removal spell isn't going to be as big of a drawback as like game 1 when you kind of just need to be more proactive.
Right, and here's the problem too, right? Is my 3 mana removal spell enough to save me in some of the aggressive games? No. But, is my 3 mana removal spell that's really dead in some matchups like worth like the spot in the main deck? Probably not. So, a lot of the decks that are green decks tend to be more linear and anyway, so that's why we see a lot of sideboard removal spells in those types of decks. So I think that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, giving green like a hero's downfall, even if it's sorcery speed.
Yeah.
Okay, should we move on to the next one?
Yeah. So the next one is one that I had kind of alluded to before when we talked about Obosh. This is one of my favorite cards in the set, and I think the main reason that I put this on here is because of the interaction with Goblin Chainwhirler. So you can return Goblin Chainwhirler, and you get to put a Menace and a Death Touch counter on it, and then it wraths your opponent's entire board of creatures.
Yeah, which is pretty sweet.
Yeah, which is pretty insane. So,
yeah.
and while we've seen things like that in Standard before, with Status Statue, this requires no extra mana investment to do that. You can do this on 3 if you have a Chainwhirler in your graveyard.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you're just playing Citrus Supplier on turn 1.
And you're hitting exactly.
Yeah.
But all joking aside, Call of the Death Dwellers also a way to like it's an odd CMC for Obosh, which you already may want to play Chainwhirler anyway, and you can get back 2 1-drops with it. So like maybe there's something to go on with that.
Yeah, definitely.
It also has applications in other formats, like you can return 2 Death Shadows, you can return a Snapcaster Mage with this. You can
Maybe you're playing this in the the Fiend Artisan deck, and you're returning a Citrus Supplier in a Fiend Artisan, which would be kind of cool.
Yeah, like
you put the Death Touch counter on your Citrus Supplier to be able to trade with something, and then you make this big menace threat.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Like there's a lot of cool things you can do with this type of card. Like being able to return 2 different creatures is important. Now, I've been trying to look and see if there's. I don't believe there are any infinite combos that you can get off of this. It'd be a little bit too broken, I think, if you could. But you can even get you could play it in Modern potentially too. Like you could return Giver of Runes and Vizier, right? And pass to your opponent, and they kind of have to like interact with it there. So
Yeah,
yeah.
It would have to be total CMC 4 for it to be super broken,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Okay.
You can also return like Eternal Witness, I guess, and like get like that kind of value chain going. So I mean,
So
yeah.
if you return Eternal Witness, can you get this card back or no?
Yes, yes.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
Yep. So you can get this back, and you have a 2/1 Death Touch Menace blocker, right? So
Which is
yeah.
pretty sweet.
Yeah, it gives you some interesting applications for it. So
it's too bad that you can't put the counters on other creatures, but that'd
yes.
probably be too good.
Yeah, probably a little bit. Like, as is, it's already like pretty ridiculous, I think. So,
Agreed.
Yeah, I'm not. I think this is a really deep card, and I'm not exactly sure what the best applications for it are. But Chain Whirler was just the one I think that stuck out the most to me, because that's a pretty insane turn, right? Even doing that on turn 4 is like really good. So,
yep.
The important thing too is like last known information also applies. So even if they kill the Chain Whirler, they're still going to lose their guys. So.
Oh shit! Okay, that's cool.
Yep. Yeah, so like they don't really have a window to stop it, which is like the pretty insane part. So you can also just return like Croxa in a 1-drop, I guess, too. Like, you're gonna sack your
Cauldron Familiar Croxa or something.
Yeah, I mean you're gonna hit your opponent for 4 and have a 1/1, but like that's still like pretty good, I think. And your Cauldron Familiar is gonna have Death Touch and Menace. So.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, like.
Or you put on it your Priest of Forgotten Gods or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's pretty sweet. There's a lot of like good 3-drops you can return in other formats too. Like you can return Ranger Captain, and get a 1-drop into your hand now, and you have a 3/3 like Death Touch Menace guy that like tutored up a Death Shadow or something. Like you can also return Lurus if you actually like put him in your deck. So
that's true.
I don't know.
And it does. It doesn't make it so you can play this main deck without turning off the companion, which is kind of cool.
Exactly. Yes. So it's like kind of a way to like fit Lurus in your main deck as more copies, while also like playing it as a companion, and also a lifelink Death Touch Menace 3/2.
Yeah.
It's like,
it is pretty scary for sure.
Yeah, so that's something I think I would actually look at a little bit. Now, you can also use Call of the Death Dweller to return like Heliod or something. Now, returning Walking Ballista doesn't do very much, but returning a Heliod may come up in certain decks. See, we've seen Black White X Heliod combo-ish decks pop up in Pioneer before, and in Standard, like obviously in the Rakdos Sacrifice deck, like returning like a 1-drop and a Priest of Forgotten Gods is great, right?
Yeah.
So, and that deck is also a Croxa deck. So, in them returning Croxa, or even returning a Mayhem Devil that has Death Touch, is pretty insane. So
that is that's pretty disgusting.
Yeah, because then you can immediately use your Witch's Oven. Like if you have a Cauldron Familiar in your graveyard and you cast Call, you get back the Mayhem Devil they killed, and then you like sack your food, sack the Cauldron, sack a food. You just like Chain Whirler to your opponent, right? And that's a line that I think will come up quite a bit in Standard. So. It's pretty sweet card, I think.
Most definitely.
So, All right, so the next one we have is one that was spoiled somewhat recently, and I'm gonna look up this one. I believe the rough translation is like In One Bite or something like that. Is the name of the card.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. Now this one is one of the removal spells. In the limited format at Uncommon. And this one I think is actually quite good. So it's a sorcery. As additional cost to cast it, tap an untapped creature you control. Exile target tapped creature. Put a +1/+1 counter on the creature you tapped to cast the spell. Now, exiling tapped creatures isn't quite as good and constructed, admittedly, but I think it will come up in enough games that this is kind of like 1 mana exile your Landwehr Elf, or 1 mana exile your, I don't know, your Rotting Regisaur. Like, there's enough decks in Pioneer and in Standard right now that actually attack with a lot of creatures or tap creatures for mana, where, sure, like, you don't get to attack with the creature that you did this with, but putting a +1/+1 counter on your creature is like no small feat, and like in some situations, like the Heliod Hardened Scales deck, it's actually a substantial upside because it's kind
That's
of like
true.
putting 2 counters on. You can like tap your Walking Ballista to this to exile their big guy, put 2 counters on your Walking Ballista, and like kill their small guys. Like there's a lot of like interesting things you can do in Pioneer and Standard with this. You can also just like in Standard, you can just like make you can just like play a creature trigger your Heliod like because you like had a creature come into play off your Daxos. Then you can immediately tap that creature to like exile the creature the flyer your opponent attacked with, and like put a counter on your small guy that you played. Now you can like attack some more. Like I don't know, it's like kind of a cool card, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you were obviously just playing this with Teferi Time Raveler and just making it into an instant speed.
I mean, in our Esper Hero deck, maybe with tap our human token
Yeah,
after
sure.
pulsing
Why
our
not?
Teferi. Like I don't know. Like there, you can do some different things with it too, where you play like Thalia Heretic Cathar, so your opponent's creatures come into play tapped. So now you
Oh,
can
that's
like always have like a viable target. Like, but even in Standard, we've got Giant Killer, right? So you can just tap their guy and like exile it immediately. So there's
yeah,
some
that's
like
true.
interesting things I think, and I think the main reason why we may see a little bit more play than these effects ordinarily would is because white in Pioneer and in Standard is lacking cheap removal. We don't have a Path to Exile or Sword to Plowshares in those formats. So and most of the white decks play creatures. So and they don't really care if it's a tapped creature because usually they're losing to decks that are attacking
Stasis
them.
kind of.
So yeah, exactly. So like being able, like I can take a hit from your Routing Regisaur and then exile it. I can take a hit from your Spell Queller and now I'm playing a spell you have to counter. Like stuff like that. So I think there's enough reasons to play this card in Pioneer, especially because the main white deck right now, Mono White Devotion. While this is a little bit worse than Stasis Snare in that deck specifically, maybe we see this
Devotion.
exactly. Maybe we see this as a 1 or a 2 of, but I could also see it in the black white or Savara's deck because they play Cartouche anyway. And oftentimes you're going to have a creature that you want to tap to just slow your opponent down. And, that deck doesn't actually get to play really any removal spells. So, having access to something like this is pretty interesting, I think.
Yeah. At the end of the day, though, it's probably just going to be more of a limited card than anything, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is probably a great limited card. But, I think it has... I think it being 1 mana and buffing up your guy a little bit means that it's fringe playable and constructed. So I think it'll be really, really interesting to see if it actually sees play. But it's at least cool mechanically. Like we haven't really seen effects that put a counter on the creature used to pay the cost. So
that's true.
Yeah, and it's a flavor home run. You eat the guy and you get a little bigger, right? So
yeah,
it's so I don't know.
Yeah,
it's
at least
it's
it
a sweet
doesn't make
card.
a food token.
Yeah, it should.
Yeah.
All these cards, let's just add make a food to them, and
yeah.
welcome to Eldraine.
Make a food cycling, why not?
Yeah, yep. Right, so next one we have is Gem Razor. This one I don't really want to talk about too much. It doesn't really have a ton going on, but I think it's one of the more immediately constructed playable mutate creatures because you can kind of get a 3 mana 4/4 trample haste immediately off of this. Like if I play like basically any 2-drop in the format, I can immediately mutate, blow up your artifact or enchantment, and attack for 4. So, that's kind of the play pattern I envision with this. Is it's an aggressive creature. It's like an aggressive reclamation stage for a lot of decks. This is also a card that's kind of appealing in like Infect in both Legacy and Modern because, well, it's kind of a way to actually buff up like some of your creatures. Now you can't buff up like a Blighted Agent, but you can buff up a Glistener Elf with it and blow up whatever, like a Solemnity or like whatever artifact or
Is
enchantment
Blighted
you care
Agent a
about.
human?
It is a human.
Okay.
But Inkmoth Nexus and Glistener Elf are not. So,
That's
you
true.
can put it on. You can also put it on a Spellskite. And now I have a
So
4/4 Spellskite that blew up your thing.
yeah. So when you're mutating, do you just choose basically which creature keeps the power and toughness, essentially?
Yes.
Okay.
The creature on top is the power toughness you pay attention to. So you're almost always going to mutate this on top and then blow up something, and it will be able to attack immediately too.
Okay,
So,
that's cool.
yeah.
Yeah, so you're just playing Arboreal Grazer on turn 1, and then you're just playing this on turn 2 onto the Grazer, and then just getting in there for 4, right?
I mean, you could. I think that's actually a pretty good line.
Yeah.
The other thing, too, is in Pioneer, you can play Satyr Wayfinder and then put this on Wayfinder on turn 3.
Yep, true.
So, I mean, that probably destroys in Soul if you do that.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems pretty disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, now this is one of those cards where you never really want to play it as the format of 4/4, but you will if you have another, like, mutate creature that's, like, pretty interesting. Like, if you play this on 4 and then you mutate onto it with another copy of itself, obviously you're going to blow up 2, but you've lost out on a second 4/4, so, it definitely has diminishing returns in a way that I think a lot of other mutate cards don't, but I think...
it has... Oh, go ahead.
I think it has... I think it's pushed enough intentionally for a constructed play, though.
Yeah, and I mean, it has reach for whatever reason, so you can play, like, your deck that has just random creatures with reach. Like
and you can block every creature with flying, yeah.
Yeah, like Robber the Rich, because why the heck does that have reach?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. I mean, there's, like, other random creatures in this set, too, that have reach, like, yeah.
Yeah, like, definitely giving decks that want access to Sage, but it's kind of more aggressively slanted is kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, it also, like, costing 4 CMC, I think, is actually pretty relevant, too. Like, obviously, Abrupt Decay and stuff like that, so. Alright, so... Blitz of the Thunder Raptors, another card I don't think we need to talk about very much. We've seen cards like this before, like Beacon Bolt, except this can hit Planeswalkers. And it's an instant, but it doesn't count the instant sorceries in your exile. The main reason I put this on here is because you can play it in a control deck with Boros Reckoner, and just immediately kill your opponent on 5 mana. Not really reality, but kind of cool. But it's one of those cards that a deck like Arclight in Modern wanted access to this effect for a long time. In Pioneer, less so because of Treasure Cruiser or Oxyvagonus, but I think there's enough different decks in Magic that actually want access to kind of a red murder, if that makes sense. I guess it's kind of like a Dreadbore for mono-red decks.
Yeah, I mean, being able to hit Planeswalkers, like we were saying before, with the Devouring Bite, seems super cool.
Yeah, I really like that they're pushing a lot of removal spells to be able to directly interact with Planeswalkers. So, yeah, I mean, it's just I think this card's going to be... I think it's really hard to evaluate in Limited, but I think it's going to be like a pretty playable card in multiple constructed formats. So, it certainly gives Blue-Red Delver in Legacy access to a better 2-mana kill spell. Now, in both Modern and Legacy, we have access to stuff like Magmatic Sinkhole, which, for the most part is going to deal just as much damage as this, but exiling comes up a lot. You can actually, if you have no instants and sorceries in your graveyard, you can actually play this on an Uro while the trigger's on the stack and it'll exile it. Because it doesn't say if the creature dealt damage this way, it's just if that creature or Planeswalker would die this turn, exile it instead. So,
that's pretty cool.
That's kind of cool, so, yeah. Yep. Right, so the next one up is one that's been getting a ton of hype in the, in Modern and in the Eternal formats is Drannith Magistrate. Your opponents can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hands. No escaping, no activating Urza, no using Experimental Frenzy, no casting things from exile. So, you can't Cascade if this is in play. Your opponent can't Cascade if this is in play. They can't Snapcaster Mage. It shuts off a ton of effects, shuts off Conflagrate, a lot of things in Modern that it shuts off, and it shuts off a reasonable amount in Legacy as well. It shuts off Underworld Breach, though, which I think we're all happy about.
Oh, most definitely.
Yeah.
Does it so with this and knowledge,
Yeah, your opponent just doesn't get to cast anything.
that's kind of disgusting.
Yeah.
Or
Yep.
is knowledge pool just instant and sorceries?
No, knowledge pool. If you have knowledge pool and Teferi, it's going to shut them off of any spell. Um, so it's any spell for
Is
knowledge
it
pool.
any spell? Okay.
Yeah. Yep. That's why the Teferi lock works. So.
Gotcha.
Yep. And this also works with that. So obviously we want more combo pieces. So.
Yeah. For the old blue-white prison.
Oh yeah. 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 I mean, and it being a human, super relevant. It's a 2-mana 1/3, so it's pretty tough to kill for a lot of decks. Yeah, I mean, like, it also works pretty well with Spell Queller.
It's true.
So, I mean,
is, pretty gross to say the least.
Yeah, I could see Spirits playing like 2 copies of this in their sideboard. Like, it's a super impactful Magic card.
Yeah, definitely like versatile hate cards are super interesting whenever they get printed.
Yeah, and notice it says opponents, right? So in Modern, you can play this in your Snapcaster Mage deck. You can play this in your Uro deck. You can play this in your Urza deck, too. Like, and it's going to shut off a lot of relevant cards in that format. So I would expect, like, Snowblade decks, for example, to pick up a couple copies of this card.
Most definitely.
Yep. All right. Then we have Lava Brink Adventurer. This is one of the odd even cards. This comes into play, choose odd or even, has protection from CMCs of the chosen value. I think this card is incredible. In both Pioneer and in Standard. So, like a generic 3/3 normally is pretty bad, but it's very easy to just position this where it has protection from most of your opponent's deck. And, for example, against Mono Red, most of the good mono red cards are odd in both formats. They're 1 and they're 3 CMC. Now in Pioneer we have Lightning Strike and stuff like that, but generally speaking, the vast majority of the ones you care about are 1 and 3 mana. And I think that makes this card like pretty interesting in that respect, but it also has other applications in the fact that like some decks might never be able to remove this.
Yeah, I mean, if you're playing against one of the companion decks, that I think it's the blue-black hybrid that makes it to where everything's even, and then you have the black-red one that we talked about.
Yeah,
previous.
the Obosh. Yeah, I mean those decks
you just play this, and it's just like it's a Trunian Nemesis basically, which seems pretty busted.
And it dodges Bone Crusher Giant. So because Stomp CMC is 2 on the stack, right? So it dodges that, which is pretty relevant. That's one of the most played red cards in multiple formats right now. So yeah.
Like, what shell would you want to be playing something like this in?
A Heliod deck probably. But it's really awkward there because if you name Odd, you can't target it with Heliod, right?
That's true.
But it's kind of just like a really tough to remove creature. So maybe not explicitly Heliod decks, but maybe like aggro decks. I think it's like pretty interesting in decks with Thalia and stuff where like you can kind of like restrict your opponent's ability to answer your board over and over. So yeah.
Yeah, it definitely seems like kind of like a slightly more balanced Mirran Crusader, sort of.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a card that we're going to see quite a bit of in Standard in particular, but quite possibly in Pioneer and maybe a little bit of Modern. So, all right. So, also, this card seems obnoxious to deal with in Limited.
Yeah. Obnoxious and a lot of opportunities for puns with a card like this.
Oh, absolutely. So the next one up is Yudaro, Wandering Monster. This is one of the most bizarre cycling cards we've seen, and it's also pretty cool. So if you cycle a card named Yudaro, Wandering Monster, it goes into your library after going into your graveyard. You shuffle it in. And then if you've cycled a card named that 4 or more times, you just put it into play on the 4th time you cycle it. So it just gives you a win con that like doesn't use that like can't be countered with counter spells, that like also like lets you churn through your deck, and you could play 4 of this in your deck. Cycle it, make an 8/8, hit your opponent for 8. If they deal with it, you just make another 8/8. Like, I think it's pretty sweet, and I think it's also like kind of interesting. As like just a backup plan for a lot of red decks. Like you can also like in theory include this in like even aggro red decks as like a sideboard plan, because what is like the Teferi deck really going to do to like you're just going to cycle this over and over, right? There's not really much they can do about that. And eventually you're just going to have 4 8/8s with haste that come into play later. You can also just cycle it on your opponent's end step and put it into play on their end step too, and then untap and do stuff on your turn. So, I'm excited to see how this sees play.
So with this card, you draw your card that you cycle before you shuffle it back in, right?
No, you shuffle it in and then you draw.
Okay, that's kind of cool.
Yeah. I mean, I had like. This is like in Magical Christmas Land, which obviously I live in. I think there's a world in which you play this in Obosh, because it has trample. So, like if you have, like...
It also gives you something to do on turn 2, which is not, like, irrelevant.
Yeah. Now, obviously, it's not great in an aggro deck, but, like maybe like a slower deck. I don't know. It's also a combo kill with Obosh, too. Like,
yeah, I mean, maybe you're just kind of you're trying to play like a slow mid-range game, where you're just getting incremental damage in, and then you play Obosh, and then hopefully you've cycled this enough times.
Yeah, I mean, I want to live that dream once, I think.
Yeah.
Obosh itself doubles its own damage, and then this also doubles, right? So I'm hitting my opponent for like 1,000,000 damage, so...
I mean, if anybody can pull it off, it'd be somebody as lucky as you are.
I mean, yeah. Alright. I don't think there's really too much else that I want to say about this card. It's kind of one of those cards we're just going to have to play with and see, I think. I think the next card that we want to talk about, I think, is one that we're all going to get tired of in the next 6 months, is Extinction Event. Another one of the odd-even cards, but 4 mana, choose odd or even, exile each creature with the CMC value of the chosen value. I think this card is pretty ridiculous.
I mean, 4 mana conditional board wipes are usually all going to be pretty good, so...
Yeah,
there's a good chance you're going to get 2 things with this if you're playing on turn 4.
Yeah, I mean, in Pioneer, you're probably, like, grabbing, like, 3 or more things, right? Like...
Yeah, I mean, like, if you get rid of their... let's say you have to play this on turn 4 and you kill their 4-drop and their 2-drop, like, that's pretty backbreaking.
Yeah, that's insane, right? There's, like, it also gives you a way to beat, like the mono-green Stompy deck in Pioneer is basically 1s, 3s, and, like, Galta, right?
Yeah.
So that deck, you just name odd, and they lose, like, almost everything. Like, they have 2-drops, but for the most part, their deck is built around 1s and 3s. Also, mono black is another one that is built around 1-drops. So, and it itself actually has a good amount of evens. So, if your opponent has Scrappy Scrounger and a Rankle in play, you can hit those on turn 4 with it. So,
exactly.
Yeah, against the mono white deck in Pioneer, that deck is mostly even CMC'd outside of Heliod. But if you just want to get Heliod off the table, you can just name odd. But most of the time, you're just going to name even, and you're going to get rid of their Arcanasal, their Daxos, their like whatever. So, I think this card's fantastic. Obviously, it's fantastic in Pioneer, but I think it has a ton of application in Standard as well. Just more interesting board wipes. It's a board wipe that exiles. It's dope. So.
Yeah. I mean, it gives you a lot of interesting thought between playing something like this over like a Languish or...
Right, exactly. And I think in some matchups it's going to be worse than Languish, but I think in a lot of matchups you're fine with 4 mana exile 1, sometimes 2 creatures. Like It also doesn't target, so we can absolutely destroy the Orzavaros deck, which I'm always a fan of. But I think the real value is even more cards that we can use to shut down Boggles in Modern. So
Yep.
Yeah.
Most definitely. The
Yeah.
menace.
Yep. All right. So the other one I want to talk about briefly is Dirge Bat, and now this one I'm not really expecting it to see much constructed play, but we've seen cards like Noxious Gearhulk see play. Before that, like maybe we see some avenue for this, but it's mostly a card that's kind of pushed just enough. Like 4-mana 3/3 flash flying is good, but it's mostly a card that you want to play and then mutate onto it with something else. But obviously an insane card in limited, like, but
yeah, I mean, the fact that this has flash, I feel like is huge.
I think so too. Like, I just want to play this on 4, untap, mutate the octopus onto it, blow up my opponent's flying blocker, draw a card, hit them for 3. Like, that seems dope.
And then maybe you have like a 3-mana mutate too.
Yeah. Or double octopus, because that's the world I live in draft.
Yeah, right.
I'd like at pre-release.
I mean, like, seems like most of the time you're going to be hoping to flash this in on Tinian on 5, like you were saying.
Yes. Yeah. I think so.
It is nice that you can top deck it later and just pay the 6 mana to just mutate it onto something and kill something right away.
Yep. Now,
so with mutate and flash, you can cast its mutate as flash, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So you can get some like interesting 2-for-1s with this, but it is important that if you're spending 6 mana, most of the time you're not going to also get value off of its body for that. So most of the time it's just going to be 6 mana, destroy a creature, give a creature you control flying, which isn't great, but in limited that's great. But in constructed itself, it's not nearly as great. I think the quality of Dirge Bat in constructed is mostly going to depend on what the other mutate creatures look like, and I don't think it'll see play outside of standard, but I could see some fringe standard play.
I could see that.
Yeah. All right. So the next one is Luminous Broodmoth. This one has some cool combos with it. Obviously, it's kind of like a Nightmare Shepherd in a lot of ways. But some people are talking about you can kill on turn 4 with this card in both Pioneer and Modern. And you play Solemnity on 3, and then you play this on 4, and you have a Fanatical Firebrand in play. And so it'll come back into play, but it can't have the counter put on it because of Solemnity. So then you just immediately sack it over and over, and your opponent dies, which is super sweet. So
yeah, obviously all of these 3-card combos.
Well, of course. Another thing you can do with Luminous Broodmoth, which is something that I think may actually see a bit more play in Modern, is you can play it with Hex Parasite. And you can just remove the flying counter from your creatures. And so you can kind of like build up this board state where maybe you're like Mardu Shadow, and your creatures can just never die. Outside of Luminous Broodmoth, so they like have to kill it first. But 4-mana 3/4 flyer is like reasonable enough when it has other upside. But you can also do some cool things with it in Pioneer, like it can help protect your you can play it in mono white, right? And you can like protect some of your ground creatures with it. Obviously it doesn't work great in spirits, but I think there's enough like cool things you can do with it. You can play it in like the zombies deck, right? And just like get your zombies back again to like continually drain your opponent, and maybe that's an avenue to explore a little bit. It's kind of like another Rally of the Ancestors in that circumstance. So
yeah, I mean it's kind of a cool upgrade to Undying, Unflying.
Yeah. Yep. All right. The next one we kind of talked about a little bit with the bat is the Sea Dasher Octopus. I think this card is absolutely incredible. It's fucking insane. This card is incredibly similar to Curious Obsession. Sure, you're paying 2 mana for this effect, but if you have a 1-drop, it's kind of a 2-mana Curious Obsession, right? But it's a Curious Obsession that doesn't need a creature. You can just play it. And how Mutate works, if I'm mutating onto a creature and my opponent kills that creature, I just have the 2/2 now. So normally they're going to wait until the Mutate creature gets onto the creature, and then you'll lose it forever. So it's still vulnerable in that sense to the 2-for-1s, but if my opponent has been killing my guys, I can just flash this in as a 2/2. My opponent has to kill it. And that's something that I think is incredibly important that a lot of people are overlooking. They're like, well, it's a 2/2 for 3. What is it really attacking through on the ground? And it's kind of like if I'm playing a deck that operates a lot of instant speed, I can kind of just, my opponent oftentimes will want to do stuff on my end step, right? So they'll want to like kill my guys on my end step so I can't like counter stuff on their turn. Well, I can just flash this in on turn 3. And they cannot let it connect. So it's immediately going to force them to interact with it. And I think that's something that's very subtle and huge, but it also lets you, again, you can mutate on your opponent's end step. So you can just like flash in a guy, like Frilled Mystic their guy, untap, mutate onto the Frilled Mystic, call that a day, right? You could also just like turn 4, like if they don't do anything, you just like and end step mutate holding up like a negate or something like that,
Yeah, I mean, being able to flash us in against control decks definitely seems pretty sweet.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of the one like drawbacks of something like maybe your Simic Flash or whatever, that you kind of like don't really have a way of catching back up on cards, and something like this may kind of help you a little bit with that.
Yeah, I mean, like, one of the problems with Spectral Sailor is that card fucking sucks when you're paying 4 mana to draw a card, but now you're just not paying any mana, and it works well with Spectral Sailor, so.
Yeah, definitely.
And humans don't typically have Flash, so.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
Alright, so the next ones we're going to talk about, I'm kind of going to talk about them very quickly, are the 2 Planeswalkers. Luca, which the only reason that Luca is worth talking about is because he works well as a polymorph card. You can just minus on like a token you control, keep revealing until you hit like an Emrakul or Void Winnower or Sundering Titan or something, and he works well with Dwarven Mine. Because Dwarven Mine on turn 5 is very likely going to give you a 1/1 to immediately minus on with Luca. So we've seen that deck pop up in Pioneer and in Modern a little bit, and I think that's the only real reason to talk about Luca's because of that minus effect.
Yeah.
And Vivian, I think, actually is a card that if you untap with it, you just win the game.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a super insane card advantage.
Yeah, you just, alright, like, I make a 3/3, hopefully I can untap with the Vivian through my 3/3. Now, I think this is pretty refreshing that we're seeing a powerful 5-mana Planeswalker that doesn't have 7 or 6 loyalty, right? It goes to 4 when you make a 3/3, but when you untap and minus, you probably just win the game. So if I'm minusing and I'm playing a 5 or a 6 drop, I get a 4 or a 5 drop, right? So
I mean, it should obviously just be 3 mana and have all the same abilities, right?
Yes.
But
it should be a +2.
Yeah. Well, it should be a 5 loyalty instead. Just because, I mean, I don't want to play my 3-mana Planeswalker and have it just die.
Yeah, that wouldn't make any sense, right?
Yeah.
So maybe it'll make a clue token instead of a beast token or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, definitely like seems super sweet in some kind of like green mid-range decks where just a little bit more card advantage that you wouldn't normally have access to.
All right, so we'll play this. We'll make our beast token. All right, we'll block with our Arboreal Grazer and our 3/3 so the Vivian lives. All right, I'll untap. I'll play my Hydroid Krasis, and I'll get my Cavalier of Thorns.
Yeah.
So
the crazy thing that it you can also give your beast reach, so
yes,
it can't be killed by flyers. Seems insane.
Yep. I would imagine that's one of the most common modes.
Yeah, like maybe you do Vigilance if you want to start getting in while holding something back. But yeah, the fact that you can gives you a little bit extra reach is always good.
Aha. Also, let's not discount the fact that Vivian has a passive card advantage engine.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean that seems like the most relevant part for sure to me.
Yeah, like she gives you a 3/3 every turn and probably another card every turn. Like, that's just ridiculous. Like,
yeah. I mean, also just being able to get the information of whatever's on top of your deck to kind of influence your plays on your opponent's turn leading into your next turn is super sweet. Even if you can't cast whatever it is right away.
Yeah, I mean, like, it also synergizes really well with the minus, right? Because now you can cast a creature. If you didn't have one in hand when you played Vivian, you make it 3/3. You're like, well, now I can look at the top of my deck and see whether or not I should block to keep the Vivian alive, because maybe it's a creature. If it's not a creature and I get the Vivian alive anyway, well, if the next card is a creature, I can use that to trigger the minus. So
yeah. Well, the other crazy thing is, I feel like with a planeswalker like that, its minus would be cast a creature in kind of like a cascade effect, rather
right,
than being able to just
to search, yeah,
Being
yeah.
able to search is insane. I mean, that's probably why it has such a low loyalty for 5 mana.
Yeah, I think it needs to have that low loyalty. I think this is a dangerous amount of loyalty for this card to begin with.
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, the fact that you can minus, I mean, it's very unlikely that you're going to be minusing on the play it, which is kind of, because it's most likely going to be your 5 mana, and it's going to start at 4 loyalty, because you're not going to have any creatures to be able to cast the turn you cast it. But like the 3/3 is most likely going to be able to give you another turn to where you're going to be able to, like you were saying, play your 6 mana creature, go get a 5-drop creature. Like, that's ridiculous.
yeah, like, and I think something that's important to keep in mind is this is a +1 to make it 3/3, right? So, like, the Vivian immediately protects herself, which is an important benchmark for most planeswalkers. But she doesn't have to ever risk making that 3/3. You can just make the 3/3 always, and that means that if your opponent can't kill the Vivian through a 3/3, they're probably never going to be able to remove the Vivian. So I think it's dangerous that she protects herself with a reasonably sized creature. In limited, a 3/3 probably isn't going to protect your Vivian, right?
But that being said, having a planeswalker that doesn't just tick up to some game-winning ultimate is actually super refreshing.
Yeah, I think the problem with this card is the ultimate. I think playing the card is itself its ultimate, right? Like, that's I think it's a card where if you untap with it, you don't have to bother ticking up to the ultimate. You kind of have your card advantage engine on lock. I think it's just really dangerous in constructed in particular. A 3/3. Creatures are smaller in constructed. A 3/3 is huge in constructed when you're getting it every turn to protect your planeswalkers. So I think it's potentially dangerous. Like, and as we mentioned before, reach, right? Oftentimes, how are these types of planeswalkers that make tokens typically dying? Well, your opponent has 2/2/1 flyers or whatever. Well, now those don't kill the Vivian, right?
Yep.
So I think it's I think it's an incredibly powerful card. So.
Oh, I most certainly agree.
Yeah.
Definitely going to be pretty strong, as if Green didn't need any more help in Standard.
Yep. All right. The next card we're going to talk about, I think, is one of my favorite cards in the set, even though the art is unfortunately awful. Is the Mythos of Nethroi. This is.
I believe the arts are all super sweet on these Mythos cards.
Pass. Pass. I like a lot of Seb McKinnon's art, but I don't like this.
This specific one, or you don't like any of them?
I don't like any of the cave painting style artworks. This one I think is really important for them to have printed, though.
Have printed this specific card?
Yes.
Okay.
We needed good removal. And while people kind of look at this card and they're like, well, I don't know what the fuck it does, it's actually it's basically 3 mana destroy target creature or destroy any non-land permanent if it was like a 3-color card, right? So, and we needed this type of effect for Standard and Pioneer, I think, because being able to destroy any non-land permanent for 3 mana isn't something that our mid-range decks really have access to, and those are the ones that are most likely going to be able to fulfill the condition. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely flexible removal spells if you have the mana to play it. I mean, you're definitely not going to be in a non 3-color or 4-color deck, right?
Right. I mean, you can play it in Niv. You can play it in like, this is another card that maybe Abzan can make a little bit of a comeback. Like,
and it definitely is seems like a sweet limited card, because at face value it's just a 3 mana murder. But
which is great.
Depending on if your mana is good enough, then maybe it turns into something more.
Like destroy a Vivian for 3. The next one is also in the Mythos cycle. Now there's 5 of these. It's Mythos of Brokos. This is the Sultai one, And this is one of the only cards in the game that lets you search your deck for a card and put it into your graveyard. We've seen some other cards do this, and it's typically very powerful. But why that's so cool with Mythos of Brakos is if I'm using this as a 3-color card, I can immediately return the card that I put into my graveyard to my hand.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a tutor and a card advantage spell, all like wrapped up in one.
So does something like this make it better than, like, let's say, like a demonic tutor or something like that?
Yes.
Or diabolic tutor, I mean. That's the 4-mana
Yeah,
one, right?
Yeah, because demonic is 2 mana, but this is absolutely better than those. And we have Mastermind's acquisition as well, right? Yeah, because you get 2 cards. Now, you can't get instants and sorceries back with this. You can only get permanents, but I think that's fine.
You can put a non-permanent card
into your graveyard, yes.
If you want to.
Correct. Where I think we'll see this card see play is obviously in Standard, there is a Sultai deck. Maybe they play it, maybe they don't. But I think this card will see play in Pioneer Sultai as potentially a one of. It's a card advantage engine that can also like be another like 5th traverse type effect. So,
which is pretty sweet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like the worst thing about a lot of these like return a permanent, like a card from your graveyard to your hand cards, is like, what if there really isn't anything for me in my graveyard? And the fact that this is like a tutor at worst seems decent for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you can always return a card you cycled in before or a Fabled Passage. So,
yep, definitely.
The next one that I want to talk about is one that is on here mostly because of Turbo Emrakul, which is obviously a deck that is my pet deck in Pioneer, because you can cast this card, Kogla the Titan Ape, immediately off of the Castle Garenbrig, which is a card that I've been looking for a long time. Is a big beefy creature that you can play off of Castle Garenbrig that fights almost anything else in Magic. Now, this is going to come into play, and as a 6-mana 7/6 that fights, it's going to kill almost any other creature that can be on the board. And you can play this on turn 4 in Standard and in Pioneer, and even in Modern too. You can get this off, say, Summoner's Pact, and you can go Summoner's Pact, activate Castle Garenbrig, fight your guy, untap, attack, blow up your like artifact or whatever. So there's like a lot of cool things you can do. And, I think we're going to see a lot of this card. Now, not being able to blow up an artifact or enchantment immediately makes it a little bit worse than Rexage in a lot of circumstances, but I think coming in, killing their creature, and then being able to untap with this potential value engine, but more likely than not, a Rexage effect is pretty sweet. And obviously, Castle Garenbrig is a broken Magic card, so and anything we have that costs 6 is always going to be better than it ordinarily would be.
Yeah, I mean, for Turbo, like, playing it, killing their best creature, and then if you get to attack with it, like, let's say they're a white deck and they boarded in Rest in Peace against you, like, blowing that up, and unlocking the other half of your deck that you haven't really been able to play.
Yep.
Super sweet. And it's going to end the game reasonably fast. It's a free 7/6, so...
Yep. It also... It being 6 mana in a format with Spell Queller means that even something like Sultai, which plays 1 Castle Garenbrig, or Turbo, which plays 3 to 4, or even the Ramp deck, this is a card that Spell Queller cannot hit.
Yeah.
And so we can just play this off our Castle Garenbrig a little bit early and fight a spirit, and they have to have like a Selfless Spirit or a Rattle Chains or something like that. They can't Spell Queller it, which is pretty huge, I think.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely, obviously King Kong, but
yes.
nothing wrong with that.
Yep. Yeah, I'm just happy that it being a 7/6 means that if I have like an early ramp start, I can go Castle Garenbrig, bring this down, fight your Steelleaf champion, have this live, and then block your like whatever other creature. And that's like pretty dope because I hate stompy decks in general as an archetype. It's a personal thing. I don't really like those types of decks. So I'm happy anytime I have a card that can somewhat be effective against them. Now, the other thing, too, you can do with this is randomly, although this makes sense flavor-wise, you can return humans you control to give this indestructible. Now, that lets you, in Modern, potentially set up other shenanigans. Like, you could maybe, like, I don't know that there would be a deck that would play this in Snapcaster Mage, but that's something you could do.
Yeah.
There's plenty of other humans with comes into play effects like Reflector Mage. So
I mean, your good old blue-green Snapcaster giant
Reflector Mage deck. Yeah.
Your your banned Snapcaster Ape deck.
I mean, yeah. But it can return Urza, so, like,
Yeah,
maybe there's
that is
something there.
true.
But yeah, I don't know. There's like a lot of random humans that have comes into play effects that are pretty sweet. So, and
Definitely.
like I think there's enough humans in various formats that if your opponent doesn't immediately kill this, they might never get a window to kill it again. Something like
Mm-hmm.
Mutavault out of like some decks is a human you can utilize with this, which is pretty sweet, frankly.
Yeah.
And you can also use like Noble Hierarch in Modern too, I guess. There's like a lot of random stuff where this card being a 6-mana green creature in a world with Castle Garenbrig means that you could play this card in Modern, you could play this in Pioneer, you can play this in Standard, and there's enough humans in each of those formats that I think in some matchups this might just be an unkillable card. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm excited to play with this. I think I'll probably start with 2 when the set comes out. So
Oh
um,
yeah.
it feels main deckable in the Castle Garenbrig decks to me. So or in the
Oh
Traverse
yeah.
decks. So
Yeah. I mean,
especially
you
with
just play it.
Uro.
Yeah. I mean, you just play as a one of,
Yeah.
and it probably won't hurt you too much.
Yep. And Uro helps get you to Castle Garenbrig mana to play this. So helps you bridge
Yep.
that a little bit. Like it's also pretty dope with the Devouring Bite. So, now you can kill their guy on 3, and then like maybe do something on 4, and then on 5 you Garenbrig, and then you play this and kill their other guy. So,
Mm-hmm.
some pretty sweet things. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what the best human necessarily to use with this is.
Yeah, but maybe you don't even need to.
Yeah, like you might not need to. I mean, there's in Modern you can use like Eternal Witness, which is pretty sweet. Um, but I'm not sure that you really need to in other formats. I don't think. I think it's mostly just flavor. I think Mutavault is probably one we'll see more often than most,
Yeah,
because some of the Stompy decks can play Mutavault. So.
that is actually pretty sweet.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And they can't because Kogla targets, they can kill the human you're targeting in response, but then they needed 2 kill spells, and at that point, your Kogla was probably dead anyway. But
Yeah.
so the last, well, for the most part, the last cards that we're going to talk about are this cycle of, frankly, cards that I'm not happy exist. I don't like 3-color cards. I don't like overloaded cards. I don't like legendary creatures too much, and I certainly don't like mana costs that are really bizarre. And frankly, all of their mutate costs are pretty bizarre. I think these cards are quite pushed and powerful, and I would be surprised if we didn't see at least one of these make waves in constructed. I would expect more than that. Like Snapdax, I actually expect to see constructed play. Though the biggest thing holding it back is that it's a Mardu card.
Yeah. Well, it's actually secretly a Simic card because it has
Right.
3 creature types.
Yes. Now, so fun little tidbit. I don't know if you looked at the creature types too closely for these, but it actually is a wheel of creature types. So you have Dinosaur, Cat, Nightmare, and so if you actually arrange them, you have 2 of each creature type, right? Or like 3 of each creature type. Right? I think it's 3 of each creature type. So you have a Beast Elemental Dinosaur, right? And then you have a Nightmare Beast Elemental. Okay.
Okay.
So right.
So
So
there's. Okay, so each one is twice.
yeah, I think each one is 3 times. Yeah, you have
Okay,
Elemental
yeah. So
3 times, and Dinosaur 3 times, and Cat 3
okay,
times, Nightmare and Beast. Yeah.
that's interesting.
Yeah, and there's a specific arrangement to them too.
Where they're like, so the one's like first, middle,
Yeah,
last.
so you see you have Beast Elemental Dinosaur, and then you have Nightmare Beast Elemental, right? And then you have Cat Nightmare Beast. So there's an order, right? So Cat Nightmare Beast Elemental Dinosaur is the order. So yeah. Or that like sequence of things, which is a kind of a cool little tidbit. So
Yeah, definitely.
Yep. So obviously these cards are pretty obnoxious in limited, but I think one of the ones I think has the most potential in Constructed is Vadrox, the Apex of Thunder. So not only is it a 3-mana 3/3 flyer, which is already head and shoulders better than the others because it's a 3-drop, but like casting non-creature cards with CMC 3 or less from your graveyard for free is a pretty substantial thing in most Constructed formats. Most formats are built around cheaper CMC cards, and there's enough random stuff to mutate onto that and we also live in a world with Teferi, which is in its same color combination. So I think there's enough random stuff that I think Vadrox may actually be a card that sees like a reasonable amount of play.
Yeah, and something to note that like all of the mutate costs are basically just 2-color cards.
Yes,
so,
yes.
Which I feel like is huge, because if you just look at it like, oh, this is a 3-color card, super hard to cast, but then you kind of look at it a little closer, it's like, okay, like the Snap Dex is like a black-white or a red-white card.
Right, exactly.
And then so on and so forth.
Yep. And that actually makes them like better in a lot of circumstances because, for example, with Nethroi, like Nethroi I think is a card that also could see a lot more play because a 5-mana 5/5 lifelinker is like reasonable enough for a lot of mid-range decks, but you could also like 7 mana returning creatures with total power 10 or less. Well, there's a lot of 0 power creatures and 1 power utility creatures, so at 7 mana, like.
Yeah, going back to like our like Fiend Artisan idea.
Yeah.
Maybe you play this. Like that seems freaking. Obviously, it costs what?
7
to mutate.
Yeah.
But that's still.
Well.
Like you just like How do you ever like not have something to do after like a board wipe or something when you just like can mutate this onto something and then you just get your entire graveyard back? Like that seems pretty broken.
Exactly. So the thing to keep in mind is, one, you do need a creature, but there's some cool things that we can see in other formats, particularly with Nethroi, is you can always mutate onto a Dryad Arbor.
Yeah.
Okay. So like there are enough like random free creatures in various formats, but Nethroi also works similar to Protein Hulk. In the fact that it's any number of creatures with total, right? So with Protein Hulk, one of the things we did and why it was so broken was because there was there was a lot of different combos, but before the Karmic Guide combo was figured out for Legacy, you could actually return all of the 0-mana 0/0s in the game all at once and trigger like a Disciple of the Vault. So with Nethroi, you can do a similar thing. You can get all of these creatures with 0 power all into play.
And like get like a couple aristocrats or something.
Yeah, or like you could get a bunch of defenders and set up like some wall win con or something like that. Like maybe in an Axebane Guardian deck, like there's enough like defender payoffs that like maybe there's like some merit to it. But yeah, you could just return a bunch of 0, like 4 Walking Ballista, 4. Like in theory, if I get to 7 mana with Nethroi, I should be able to win the game by mutating. You can just return. In the same way that you can win with Rally the Ancestors, too. You can just return, like, a bunch of Blood Artist effects, and then 4 Walking Ballista, 4 Endless One, 4 Hanger Backwalker, 4 whatever, Ugin's Transmogran or whatever. Yeah, exactly. So, and 0 power creatures, you can return, all of your Gilded Goose that are in your graveyard without actually escalating. So, I think this is actually, like, something that makes a graveyard payoff in Standard or in Pioneer actually substantially better than a lot of other cards, because it being a creature that's pretty reasonable on its own, I think is something that's really important. Also, with Nethroi, you could play it on 4 off of a Mana Dork and then mutate it on 5.
Mm-hmm.
So
do you have kind of like a tier list as far as like what you think out of these 5, the cycle, like a 1 through 5 list?
So, in terms of like constructed tournament play,
just in general.
Well, I can't really evaluate from Commander because I don't really play that format.
No, not talking about Commander.
Oh, okay. I think I think there's 3 that I would expect to see constructed play, and that would be Nethroi, Vadrox, and Snapdax. I think Snapdax is probably number 3 for me, just because of the color combination it's in. I think Nethroi and Brockos are in the best color combination, but Brockos doesn't really do anything in constructed.
Yeah, I mean, just being able to cast it a bunch of times is like kind of whatever, but it doesn't have
Yeah.
ETB. It doesn't really do much.
Yeah, it's just a 5
It's just
mana 6/6 trampler, which is whatever in constructed. So,
yeah,
like Muldrotha already doesn't see play, and that like arguably gives you more. Now, difference between 5 and 6 is substantial, and this is a creature you can cast from your graveyard onto a Narcomoeba, which is pretty dope.
Yeah.
But I'd rather cast an Uro, I think.
Yeah. I feel like there's just so much more that you'd rather in a deck that's playing those colors.
Yeah. Now I could see it as a one of in like the black green dredge style decks, or like a two of, because you can upgrade your Stitcher Supplier or your Narcomoeba into a 6/6 trampler. So there may be merit to like playing like one or two of it there, but I don't think it's as good as the others.
Yeah, so you'd say that Broncos is probably the worst?
I actually think the Teamer one, Luna, is the worst.
Okay.
That color combination, you can't really... There's not a ton you can do with it in that color combination. It also only lets you like put permanents into play. It's hard to control the effect.
That's fair. It also costs like one more to mutate, and for not really that much of a... Like, sure, you get like a random free spell, but the fact that it's not like... You could get like some dorky like 2 or 3 mana spell, and you're like...
Or you could get an opt or something, like, yeah. You know, there's most of our decks aren't super high impact cards, and 6 mana to cheat something big into play isn't particularly realistic with this type of card. So, because the worst case scenario is you hit another copy of itself, right?
But you can put it into your hand at least for whatever the heck that's worth. Because it's not.
That's true, but you could also like mutate, right, and put this as like if it's a 6/6, right, you're just going to put another copy of it into your hand to do it again the next turn. But say you don't want a Luna to be the actual creature, right, and you just give a like 6/6 you control already that ability, you had another copy. Well, now you have a free 6/6 trampler. But being able to put it into your hand, that's true. That's like pretty relevant. But most of the time, I don't think it actually is.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is it says put that card onto the battlefield or into your hands. So
yes.
You're not even casting it. So
correct. Yes.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah. Yep. So I think Luna's the worst. I think Broxus is probably number 4 for me. I'm not convinced about Vadrox, but I think because it's the cheapest, and its mutate is 4. Right? So it's the cheapest to cast and the cheapest to mutate. I think it has the most potential. So I think it's number 1 for me, because also non-creature cards CMC 3 or less are pretty prominent in constructed play. It's in a weird color combination, but...
It also doesn't exile it, so you can keep doing it over and over again.
Correct.
Which seems relevant.
Yeah, if you get like a second Vadrox and you mutate again, now you can cast 2, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's something that I think has a lot of potential. It's in an awkward color combination that requires you to have non-humans. But it is pretty sweet, and I think this one could see modern play. Now, you can't put it onto a Snapcaster Mage, right? But, there's enough other creatures, I think, that, like, maybe you can, like, mutate onto this, cast it to Fairy, like, bounce their guy, or, like, cast, some random card, like, it's also strange that it being Jeskai means you lose out on a lot of proactive effects, because oftentimes when you want to tap out for non-creatures in that color combination, very rarely are they proactive cards. Right? So if I'm casting like a Kolaghan's Command, well, now I'm a 4-color deck, right? Although maybe I'm not, if I'm not planning on ever casting Vadrox as a 3/3. But the important thing to think too, I think, with evaluating Vadrox is, it requiring double red for the mutate. It can be awkward because probably the spells you want to cast aren't really red ones. Your deck is probably just not a super double red requirement one, but even if you're a 4-color deck, you can play Vadrox in a deck and just play like one white source or one blue source and fetch it up and be able to cast him that way. So, so I think he has some very interesting modern applications, and I could see Vadrox in like various other decks as well, like that aren't even planning on playing him as a 3/3, where you can just mutate onto stuff and like as a value engine. So, So I think for me, Vadrock is the most playable. I think Nethroy is probably number 2 for me. There's a lot of combo potential with the mutating, and a 5/5 lifelinker for 5 is like a pretty reasonable fail case in most constructed formats. I think the problem with Snapdax is Mardu is really tough, and this is a card where Snapdax, obviously, like most of the others, you want to mutate primarily, but for Snapdax, it's really important to also be able to play it as the 3/5 Double Striker. Because 3/5 Double Striker for 4 mana is a pretty good rate, and then if you mutate the next turn, like Snapdax is the one that I think is the best in multiples. Because you play it on 4, and then you mutate onto it with another copy, and you get 2 mutate triggers, you blow up things for 4 damage each, and then you get to hit your opponent for 6, right? So I think Snapdax is the best one in multiples, but it's also like in an awkward color combination. So, I
feel like Vadrock is fine too.
I think Vadrock is fine in multiples. I think there's more diminishing returns on the trigger because you can't use 2 triggers to cast the same card.
That's fair.
So I think there's more diminishing returns for Vadrock in multiples than there are for Snapdax. But if you're playing a deck that plays a lot of like cantrips and charter courses and maybe stuff like that, or maybe you are a 4-color deck and you're playing the reanimation spell with like Chain Whirler, or maybe you're playing like in like some other format, you're playing like Kolaghan's Commands, and maybe you play Vadrock in like the Niv-Mizzet deck in Pioneer, right? And sure, you can't cast Bring to Light or Sweepers with it, but that deck plays things like Thought Erasure and Dreadbore and stuff. So maybe in some decks you can actually leverage multiple copies a lot more. So
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Yep. So the last 2 cards that we're going to talk about, I had both me and Andrew pick our favorite cards in the set. The flavor-wise, generally speaking, or as long as you like the flavor of the card. So for me, it's Voracious Great Shark, because like when you read what Voracious Great Shark does, you kind of understand why it does that. Like this is what's called evocative design. When you read the effect of the card, it evokes like an emotional response, and you completely understand the flavor. The reason it counters an artifact or creature spell is because it's eating the boat or the person, right? So and I think that makes a lot of sense, and it makes sense why it's a 5/4, right? Like with Flash, it kind of comes out of nowhere and it's huge. So I think this was a flavor home run for me, and I love evocative design type cards. So
yeah, I was very close to picking the Shark Typhoon.
Yeah.
I figured that since you went with the Shark, I had to go with something a little bit different. And as a guy that likes puns a lot, I picked Back for More. Which seems like a super sweet limited card, because we've seen cards in limited that have been pretty close to playable. Where so this card is a 6-mana black-green card, and but it returns creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield, which usually a lot of those are 5 mana, and they never make. They're kind of like your 25th or 26th card. That doesn't really make the cut just because it doesn't really do anything.
Yep.
But the fact that when this comes into play, it fights something, so it's like a
suitor removal spell.
Seems like it's gonna maybe make this like I wouldn't say premium removal spell, but it's definitely a solid playable that you'd probably pick reasonably highly.
I think this card being an instant is like pretty insane.
That's the other thing, is that the fact that you can ambush stuff. So let's say they go to attacks, you bring back your big ass thing that they fucking killed the turn
like
prior.
A 4/4 or whatever.
You kill their one guy, you keep your 4/4, then you can block their other thing, and you just decimated their board with one card. Seems super sweet to me.
Now there's a chance that your guy fought their guy, and then you block, and you might lose your guy anyway, but you traded 6 mana to kill 2 creatures? I
feel like that's fine.
6 mana to kill 2 creatures into speed is great in limited. Also, there's kind of a red spell that does a similar thing, where it's 2 target creatures fight each other.
Yeah, the instant, right?
Yeah. And I think this is pretty similar to that card, but I think this has a higher upside.
Yeah. Well, you also, why don't we just combine the 2 cards that we picked? So you're Back for More, your Great Shark.
to counter their thing, fight their guy, block their other guy.
Yeah. Seems pretty sweet.
I mean, I'm sure I'll get to do that at least once. So.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I love Back for More. I think I love playing limited cards like that. I'm a little concerned about how powerful the set looks in terms of limited
This
so far.
this set seems like ridiculous.
Yeah, there's so many cycling ones too. Like
Yeah,
there's
definitely doesn't seem like you're going to be out. Like, there's going to be a lot of playable cards. It seems like.
yeah, I think part of the thing too is like we haven't seen if there's two like obviously there's some like unconditional removal spells like pacifism and stuff that get better because of mutate, but at the same time I'm concerned we might see some of the same effect that the original Theros had, where the removal isn't enough to like shut down. Like I play my 2-drop, I mutate onto it, I mutate onto it, I mutate onto it, and you lose because you couldn't stop my mutate chain, because all of these, when this creature mutates, stack, right? So I get one trigger the first time and then two and then three, and I'm just a little concerned that like if the first person to build a big mutate creature just like can't really like lose.
Yeah. Well, thankfully the power and toughness doesn't stack, right?
Yes,
So
which is good.
It's whatever's on top.
Yes.
Okay.
But
So, I mean,
most of
from
the
that-
value is going to be from triggers, right? Like most of them have a trigger associated with it.
Yeah, I mean, it could be.
Like
I guess it could be worse if it was more like bestow rather than the mutate.
yes.
It would be
So
pretty disgusting.
there's this one I wanted to bring up. I'll bring it up on here that I think this kind of is. So I think there's a couple that I think are kind of symptomatic of why I think this could be an issue. Before we briefly sign off, is this one here, the Glowstone Recluse, where when it mutates you put 2+1 counters on it. Those counters stay regardless of what creature's on top. And I think like obviously you can just like mutate onto it and it's a 4/5. It's green, yeah. So it's just a 4-mana 4/5 reach at minimum. Like which is pretty great. Or you play it as a 3-mana 2/3 and then mutate onto it. The other uncommon, I guess the uncommons are probably the problematic ones, but the Auspicious Starix, like you it's not look at the top X cards. It's when it mutates, exile cards until you hit X permanent cards, where X is the number of times it's mutated. Now, you can hit lands, right? But if you mutate once, like
puts it right on the battlefield too.
Yes.
And thankfully, this one's 5 mana for 6/6, which is a great rate.
Right.
But
yes, it's phenomenal rate.
Is
6 mana. Yes.
Yeah.
But I think that's still like. I think this card's like phenomenal, right? Like this is I think mutate in the limited format. There's enough cards like this one. When it mutates, return a creature an opponent controls. That card seems like pretty premium to me. Each opponent sack, or they sack a creature. Like a lot of the uncommons seem like pretty unbeatable if your opponent untaps with it. Like even the Hemophage, where your opponent loses X life, you gain X life for X number of times it's mutated. You just like it's 1 and then 2 and then 3. Like that's a pretty good swing. Like
I mean, how much like there hasn't really been much like hexproof or also right?
No, there hasn't.
So
there's this one here, the 3/6. You can have it come into play with a flying counter or a hexproof counter on it.
Oh, okay, then you can just
you can just mutate onto it. But it's a 6-drop. But
it's a 6-drop, yeah.
But my point is that I don't think the lack of hexproof is super important, because there isn't a ton of unconditional removal yet that we've seen, though there is an uncommon murder at 4 mana, and there is pacifism, and we have Capture Sphere. I kind of want to see a little bit more of those effects. I would like to see some more expensive, like 5 and 6 mana removal spells in addition.
The other disgusting thing about, like, they put a pacifism on it, but you can just keep mutating onto it.
Yes, to get the value, yes.
Like, which is disgusting.
Yep. I mean, thankfully the one that blows up artifacts and enchantments is a rare, right? So, but
if that was an uncommon, that would be pretty egregious. For
sure. But like even the Huntmaster Liger, right? Like, like if I go like playing this on a like I play a 2-drop and I mutate onto it and I attack for 4. Like, sure, that's not great, but later in the game, like
it also mutates for 3.
Yes, exactly. Like, so you just can do it on curve on your 2-drop, right? Mutate for 3. It like. attack for 3. Like, admittedly, that's not great, and it wants you to have other creatures, but it's a cheap mutate, right? Like, you know, and that's something that's like a little bit concerning, I think, with how the mechanic looks like it may play out. But I'm super excited to play this limited format. I love
Oh yeah.
cycling. I love
I mean, Our Devastation was one of my favorite limited formats. So
trash.
hey man, it was cycling. Cycling it kind of it makes the games feel a lot less awkward, regardless of if it's like a fantastic format or whatever, because you kind of like feel like you get to do stuff when maybe you wouldn't be able
Yeah.
to otherwise. Like there was the 7-mana 7/7 that has cycling too.
Yeah, the
Where it's like,
sandworm. Yeah.
yeah, like where usually you're like, fuck, I don't want to put too many 7 drops in my deck because I don't want to like,
Yeah.
oh, my opening hand has 2 of this card, and I'm just like, well, sick. I'm just
Yep.
dying
But
before I get to turn
now it's a
turn
2-drop,
7.
right? So
Exactly.
yep. Yep.
And like some of the there's kind of the more expensive cycling ones where they put the keyword counters on stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Those are pretty sweet as well.
Yeah, like the Death Touch one seems like a great trick.
Yep. And there's like the trample one too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean this set looks super cool.
Looks super powerful, obviously, which is a trend that they've intentionally done with these sets, is increase the power level as a whole.
I mean, the just Magic has seemed to just decide that they want to just power creep pretty much everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of have to. Like, people need a reason to play with these sets. At least it's better than Born of the Gods and Journey to Nyx, right? And Dragon's Maze. Like, I would rather we have them take risks and make sets and cards that are too powerful than make an entire 200 card set where we don't want to play any cards from it.
That's very true. Yeah, I mean, definitely, like, with them trying to make Arena as flashy as they can, like, having these big, flashy things to be doing is kind of where I feels like where they want to go with it.
Yeah, it definitely makes the game, like, a little bit more interesting to view from an esports perspective, but I think it's also important to understand that it's not just about making Arena flashy, but with the more relevant digital Magic sphere, players are more willing to accept cards being banned. So Wizards can be more aggressive with banning cards. So they're able to fix their mistakes quicker than they would if Arena didn't exist. So with players more forgiving of bans, because if I invest in a deck on Arena and they ban cards from it, they're just going to refund me those wild cards on those banned cards. So, it kind of mitigates a lot of the impact of bans in general, that I think it allows them to take these risks with less blowback, even though we have had the issue in the last year, ever since the core set came out, all the core set and then Throne of Eldraine, where we've had so many bans. They definitely pushed. Green was Magic players have a really bad memory. You see all these memes of green is too good and white is fucking awful, discounting the fact that for about 6 or so years, green was fucking horrible. Yeah. And white was incredibly powerful. And they intentionally powered down white and buffed up green. Now, they also the problem with those colors, why they fluctuated and why we saw big swings, was because their color identity, like what they do as a color, is less defined, right? Like, they can both answer artifacts and enchantments. One of them is the big creature archetype. The other one is the go wide small creature archetype. But outside of that, they don't really have a defined sense of what they do. So they're experimenting with different types of white effects, like card advantage, and other utility effects, like some conditional reanimation and stuff like that. And then they're also experimenting with green card advantage and, other utility engines like food and stuff. And, they pushed the envelope a little bit too much with the green cards recently.
Yeah. Well, like, a lot of people kept saying, like, oh, green is just a card away or whatever from being super good.
And then they gave us 7 cards, right? So...
Yeah, or they, like, introduce a format like Pioneer where, oh, all of those sets where you were a green card away,
correct.
Here's, like, all of it basically at once.
Yep, exactly. So, I think Magic players generally don't really see these giant bigger picture concepts. But and not using that to discount the fact that they've definitely pushed cards like Once Upon a Time and Oko and Veil of Summer way too far, and even something like Uro. But I think it is important to understand that there can be a world where and it's okay for colors to be good and bad at different times.
Mm-hmm.
Making a perfectly balanced game is something that is pretty close to impossible, because we have a design team. We have millions of people that play this game and that try and break these formats, and we have a handful of people that are designing them. So it's a numbers challenge at its core, I think. And these are all smart people that love the game, so they don't have a reason to make cards that are going to ruin formats. Like there's no world in which they're like, oh, we hate white, so we're never going to make a good white card. Like, it's a completely irrational thought process.
Yeah, that just doesn't make any sense.
No, they want you to play their game, right? So and these are in the people designing the sets, um, are Magic players at their core. They love the game in the same way that we do. So they don't really want to see the game ruined, right? So they have an incentive to make good cards that people want to play with from set to set, which I think is great. But we definitely took too many risks, I think, in 2019 as a whole.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But all right, well, we've run kind of long, but I think it was a good initial spoiler review. So maybe we can revisit the format and stuff later when we see more cards. Maybe the end of the week or something. Maybe we can talk about limited a little bit more as we see how more of the limited format's going to shape out. But I think that's a good stopping point for today. So
sounds good.
Yep, and anyone who came by and watched, thanks for watching. I'm going to. I was recording this, so my plan is to upload this to the Patreon, and then later onto a public YouTube link. But so give that a watch if you're currently in the Patreon. If not, and you want to watch this later, I'm going to be freeing that up. It's on my YouTube and stuff. So that's kind of my plan, is to just upload this on there anyway. But I really appreciate when it's not just me talking about the cards, when I can bounce off of other people, and I really appreciated you doing this type of podcasty type format with me, Andrew. So
yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me, dude. It was fun to kind of go through the cards, kind of get back into the swing of things. Whenever a new set comes out, it's always a lot of fun. For us to kind of try and figure out what's going to be good and kind of trying to forecast. Obviously, with the whole world basically ending for a couple of months, it's a little harder to do that. But
I mean, we're not going to see the all right, Andrew, we have 1 week to break the format. Let's do it type situation. That's not really gonna happen this time, but I think that's okay.
Definitely.
So, yeah. Well, all right. Well, thanks for stopping by, guys.
Yeah, take it easy.